probably the fear and adrenaline taking over, but those were just details. He stayed still with his back to the fence for several minutes, making sure the beast wasn't waiting for him to move so he could attack. Ash found DePauli and Otto waiting for him by the paddock's gate. The large wooden entrance stood open. An intricate wrought iron portcullis surrounded the gate, black metal twisting and spiraling upward, each bar ending in a small metal star. "The beast gone?" DePauli said. "Not sure, but it didn't follow. Not yet, anyway," Ash said. "The gate wasn't locked?" "This is exactly how we found it," Otto said. He gazed into the paddock through the open gate. Had the Bigfoot escaped? Had it been protecting the paddock? What lay within? Ash said nothing as he strode forward and joined Otto and DePauli. Paddock C definitely didn't house Sasquatch. Multicolored gravel, mostly sandstone rubble, and small chunks of granite filled the enclosure, and the bleak, Mars-like terrain rolled and mounded into dunes. Bushes with dark green oval leaves dotted the landscape, but there were no trees. The hard-packed path that ran from the gate led to a hole with a diameter of 10 feet. Ash eased forward, moving carefully through the gate into the paddock. Otto and DePauli trailed after. The scent of rot and decay assailed Ash. The coppery smell of blood, of death. Just inside the gate there was a stained wood platform. Flecks of bone, streaks of black dried blood, and globs of hardened fat covered the decking. "Feed station," Otto said. "I thought Roger said the animals didn't get tended," Ash said. "He said most don't," DePauli said. "How big would a snake need to need so much food?" Otto asked. "Maybe 40 feet, Ash said as he pointed. A huge snakeskin trailed over and between mounds of gravel. The dried opaque shell speckled black and gray. Drips of fresh blood trailed away from the platform and disappeared around a mound of blue pebbles. Otto whistled. "Damn." "Explains the hole," DePauli said. A faint hissing carried on the wind. The trio exchanged glances. "Doesn't sound close," Otto said. The trio followed the thin trail of blood through Paddock C. The terrain reminded Ash of the fish tank he used to keep his turtle in as a kid. Dull, hard, and unattractive. With no trees or underbrush, Ash and company were able to walk the circumference of the paddock in 15 minutes, and when they didn't find the statue, the team took cover under a bush with prickers the size of stilettos. "The statue must be by the hole," DePauli said. "You can forget that." Ash's blood was pumping, his heart racing like an engine with a pinned gas pedal. "What about you, Otto?" Otto made a face like he just downed a skunked beer. Then, being ever practical, he said, "If we both go and retrieve the statue, who gets it? We can't break it in half, can we?" "I'd think not," Ash said. Trying to be a team while playing an individual sport was making things extra difficult. "Do you want to go after it? I'll step aside if you do." Otto looked embarrassed, his brown cheeks going deep red. "No, you take it. I'll take the next one." "Or I will," DePauli said. Hissing still rolled through the paddock, but Ash kept under cover behind rocks, bushes, and behind dunes of pebbles as he worked his way to the center of the enclosure. There were deep ruts in the sand going every which way, but Ash saw no other signs of the giant snake. A large dune of blue and brown stones gave way to Ash's right, revealing the southernmost edge of the hole. It was massive, much bigger than he'd originally thought, and was easily 30 feet around. Emika's crumpled body lay next to the hole, a small puddle of blood leaking into the ground around her. Her dark eyes were open, and they stared up at the tattered clouds. Ash bent and took her pulse. Nothing. She was already cold. 2 quarter-sized fang holes in her chest leaked blood, and Ash followed the drag marks in the gravel with his eyes. The snake had brought her to its hole for later, but why hadn't it brought its prize all the way home? Ash closed his eyes, and sorrow washed over him. He hadn't known Emika, and what he had known he hadn't particularly liked. She'd been a moody, overconfident, unfriendly bitch. Did she deserve to be murdered by a giant snake? He didn't think so. He searched the woman and slipped her bullet into his pocket. Then Ash tried to move on, but guilt stopped him. He couldn't just leave the woman's corpse to be devoured. He quickly gathered football-sized stones and covered Emika's mutilated corpse. It took him several minutes of hard labor, and when he was done, he dropped his pack and took a long drink of water. The hissing was getting louder. Ash put away his water bottle and worked his way around the edge of the hole. Piles of gravel and rocks blocked his view, and pricker vines and brown, stumpy bushes that stuck from the pebble-covered ground like boils caused him to retreat from the hole's edge several times. A small monument sparkled, and Ash went to it. The thin column was sculpted from blue granite with a dense concentration of quartz, and the brass nameplate affixed to it read Titanoboa. The flat top of the pedestal, clearly designed to hold a statue, was empty. The figurine Ash assumed had been there, most likely a coiled snake, was gone. 21. Ash searched around the hole, thinking maybe Emika had hidden the statue as she struggled for life, or dropped it, or used it as a weapon the way he had, but it was nowhere to be found. Either the snake had eaten it, or Sean and Candace had beaten Emika to the paddock, which seemed unlikely. The day was waning and he'd accomplished nothing. In fact, one could argue he was worse off than when the day began. His stomach grumbled, his mouth dry. Ash headed back to the others, the wind pushing around dust and dirt. It was oddly quiet, the chatter of birds and the buzz of insects distant. Ash had gotten used to the comforting confines of the forest, the crunch and rattle as small animals scurried over dried leaves. Paddock C was barren and harsh, and Ash wanted to leave. When he got back to DePauli and Otto, Ash told them what he'd found, but they wanted to see for themselves, so the trio backtracked to Emika's stone-covered corpse. "You couldn't find the statue, huh?" DePauli said, her keen dark eyes scanning the area. "If there ever was one," Ash said. Otto said nothing, his eyes sweeping over the scene, brow furrowing. "The pillar is on the eastern side toward the entrance," Ash said. He felt waves of suspicion rolling off his partners. It made him angry, but he understood. He could have hidden the statue anywhere in the paddock to be picked up later. Also, he'd found the woman's body, therefore it wasn't a stretch to surmise that he killed Emika and took the statue. DePauli asked, "Did you take her bullet?" Sweat rolled down Ash's back and he cracked his knuckles. He was no poker player, and as his stomach grumbled and pain ran down his spine, he knew he needed to tell the truth. Ash reached into his pocket and brought out 2 brass shells. "You are lucky I don't think you're a killer, because someone is sure as hell trying to make you look like one," Otto said. Ash opened his mouth to rebuff the man, then closed it. Otto was right. Of the 9, he had the most evidence stacked against him, and the argument could easily be made that Ash was Treemont. The hissing reached a fever pitch. Stones tumbled and landslides of pebbles and shifting rocks cascaded into the hole. "I think it's time to make like a tree," Ash said. Otto turned to go, but DePauli stared blankly at Ash. "And leave?" Ash said. No reaction from DePauli. Ash gently took her arm and the pair followed Otto, who was moving away from the hole and circling around a large mound of gravel topped with a thicket of pricker bushes. "Trees have leaves. It's an old joke," Ash said. He picked up the pace and let go of DePauli's arm. She jogged beside him, the crunch of gravel and sharp hissing rising over the blustery wind and her panting. "Not a very good one," she forced out between breaths. Otto bolted around the mound of gravel, cutting between Ash and DePauli, and disappeared around the hill the way they'd come, heading back toward the hole. Ash and DePauli skidded to a stop. An angular head with 2 obsidian eyes and a red tongue lashing out through 2-foot fangs rose above the hill of stones. The massive snake slithered into view, its body undulating and expanding as it moved, pushing aside gravel like the bow of a boat through white water. Ash turned and ran, following Otto's footprints as close as he could. He didn't look back. If DePauli didn't know she needed to run, so be it. He shook his head and looked over his shoulder. DePauli ran behind him, and a smirk spread over her face when she saw him looking at her. The snake saw them, and its head lifted, swaying back and forth, glassy eyes locked on the trio. Ash estimated the creature to be 60 feet long at least, and as the Titanoboa surged through the pebbles and stones, he realized running wasn't an option. The creature was fast and moving in its familiar habitat. He made a hard right, darting between two large bushes. DePauli screamed, rocks popped and cracked as gravel shifted. Ash skidded to a stop and looked back. DePauli had fallen and was sprawled on the brown gravel-covered ground. In the second it took Ash to decide to help DePauli, the argument he'd had with himself more times than he could remember ran through his head like a 10-second recap of a very long story. She wasn't his responsibility. He didn't know her, she was a competitor and could be a killer. He brushed all the rationalizations aside, and when he reached DePauli, she was struggling to get to her feet. She flinched when Ash took her arm, but when she realized it was him, she smiled and said, "Thank you." The duo ran on, cutting around thickets and piles of gravel like moguls on a ski mountain, the snake's tracks everywhere. Rocks snapped and cracked as the beast pursued them. Ash saw Otto, pumping hard toward the open gate. He was going to make it. If he could be ready to slam the gate closed as soon as Ash and DePauli made it out, they might make it also. A red tongue lashed out, just missing Otto. The snake's flat head surged through a pile of rocks and pebbles, pushing a landslide toward Otto, who skidded to a stop 20 feet short of the gate. The creature's massive girth came down with a thud, a cloud of dust and shards of stone rising from the ground. The beast slithered and swayed, throwing stones as it wiggled forward, black, glassy eyes locked on Otto. The Titanoboa paused, its angular head shifting toward the open gate. Its head swung back to Otto in disbelief, then abandoned the chase and slithered out the gate and disappeared into the forest beyond. "Not good," DePauli said as she came to a stop next to Ash. "At this point, who gives a turd?" Ash said. "Can it get out of the valley?" Otto asked. "Goddamn people and their caring and ethics. I don't know," Ash said. He wondered if Otto was more concerned about the creature's welfare, or the havoc it might create as it destroyed the valley and moved on. DePauli said, "Did that just happen?" "I do believe it did. You okay?" Ash said. DePauli nodded. Ash shifted on his feet, not sure what to do next. "Should we check the snake den? See what it's got down there?" DePauli said. Otto and Ash looked at each other, then laughed. "Are we in a horror movie?" Otto said. "You are joking, aren't you?" Ash asked. "No, I wasn't." The laughter died like the two men had heard the bubble and suck of an empty beer tap. "You want to climb down the snake hole?" Otto said. The man normally sounded arrogant, but his tone was laced with sympathy. "I just thought with the thing gone we could—" "Gone? It could come back at any minute. In fact, that's the first thing it's going to do as soon as it catches more prey, if it behaves anything like a regular snake. And there could be more than one," Ash said. That comment struck home, and the three companions exchanged wary glances. If there was a moment to break the fellowship, it was now, but Ash said nothing. DePauli looked around nervously, her bracelets tinkling as she put her hands on her hips. Otto said, "We can't stay here. The statue is gone, so I'm gone. You guys coming?" He didn't wait to hear an answer and started walking. There was strength in numbers, and until that changed, Ash saw no downside to sticking together. Plus, he liked that Otto was taking charge. That gave him some time to think. Ash and DePauli followed, and the party eased stealthily through the open gate. The snake's path through the forest was easy to see, the beast's massive girth having flattened the undergrowth. The sun had disappeared over the lip of the valley, and tall shadows fell across the woods. A fresh breeze had replaced the chill wind, and the scent of cedar and flowers hung in the air. The companions halted under an odd-shaped conifer that looked like a disguised cell tower because it was missing every other branch. Ash broke out the food and water, and the trio ate what they had as night came on like a freight train with no station in sight. Ash pulled free the bottle of whiskey, twisted off the cap, and sniffed the contents. He sighed and took a pull, then offered the bottle to Otto, who accepted it with a smile. "What are your plans now, tonight?" Ash said. His gaze shifted from Otto to DePauli and back to Otto. "I'm useless if I'm overtired, but at the same time, I don't see how I'll be able to sleep," Otto said. He took a tentative sip and passed the bottle to DePauli, who sniffed it, wrinkled her nose, and handed the bottle back to Ash. Ash held the bottle out to Otto, who shook his head no. Ash capped the bottle and put it away. He felt better with the alcohol flowing through his veins like gasoline, rousing his senses and heating his body. "We could all go to one room, keep watch," DePauli said. "While Sean and Candace collect statues," Ash said. "You still care about that?" Otto said. "We're fighting for our lives here." "I know that, but Then start acting like it," he shouted. Ash ate the last bit of his tongue-and-cheese sandwich. How could he explain he was doing both? But was he really? Otto had a point. By all accounts, he should be scaling mountains to get out of the valley, yet he knew that was impossible. Treemont, whoever the hell he was, planned things well, and he'd closed this trap effectively and completely. The more Ash spun the situation around in his mind, the more he realized that even if there was a footpath or tunnel out of the valley, which there most certainly was, it would be secured or blocked. So what did that really leave to do? Survive. It was perfect. The valley, Rogers, everything was designed to force Ash and the others to play Tremont's crazy little game. The rules, statues, and the rest of it were bullshit. "I want out of this god-forsaken valley," DePauli said. But something in her tone made Ash think she was just saying what she thought he and Otto wanted to hear. "Do you have some piece of information I'm unaware of that will guide us safely from this valley?" Otto said, his tone dripping with condescension. DePauli's gaze shifted to the forest, shadows swaying and writhing in the failing light. She shifted on her feet, bracelets clinking. She turned her dark eyes on Ash, her fierceness tempered by vulnerability and beauty. DePauli didn't even look at Otto. All her frustration and anger was focused on Ash. He was the one she wanted. He was the person she needed to guide her, help her, support her, be her partner. But Ash wouldn't do that. This had been his worry. Otto had been right. They should have never let the woman join their little fellowship. Ash cracked his neck and rolled his shoulders as he fought with himself like Gollum. He was being an ass. The woman was afraid. That didn't mean she couldn't kick his ass. She was asking for a little humanity, and that didn't make her weak, it made her human. So why didn't Ash trust her? Ash wasn't so far gone that his mother's mantra of practice kindness didn't still hold sway in his psyche. He'd been slandered, abandoned, ridiculed, mocked, fired, and thrown in the trash, and he'd become a cynical, unforgiving, attack-first, ask-questions-later person, but he still felt an ache in his chest when he saw someone in pain or disabled. His cheeks still burned when he saw injustice, bullying, or the downtrodden being abused. He was who he was, and though he often tried to shake the morals of his past life, they stuck to him like superglue. He took DePauli's arm and turned to Otto. "I think we can make it to the bear paddock at the base of the northern cliff face before dark. There should be caves, and we've got some light left. I'm sticking with the plan and going on," Ash said. Though the sun had long passed over the lip of the southern valley wall, dusk hung in the air like smoke. When night came, Ash planned to slip away and go back down into the house's basement and explore the caves. Try and see if there was a way out of the valley. But there was a Yeti down there, a pissed-off, eight-fingered Yeti, and who knew what else. "I've got a flashlight," Otto said, "but no food and only a little water." "Me also," DePauli said. Her bracelets clinked and clanged as she pulled a flashlight from her bag and held it up as though displaying evidence. "Great, we've got 3 flashlights," Ash said. "We can burn Bigfoot with our light beams." Nobody laughed as the group plunged back into the forest, angling away from the snake paddock. Ash heard hissing once while the trio debated their next course of action, but there was nothing to be heard now except the whistling wind, the crack and snap of trees, and the rattle of leaves. 22. Night was coming on, tall shadows crawling across the valley like bony fingers when Ash and the others arrived at what DePauli's map labeled Paddock F, which had a rendering of the bear-like beast at its center. The forest of evergreens and spruce thinned as the trio approached the mountainside, 2 large wooden gates standing closed like the entrance to Jurassic Park. The fencing was 20 feet tall and angled inward at the top, which would prevent even the most skilled and equipped climber from getting over the wall from within. To ensure full security, the upper part of the wall had nails and spikes protruding from its side, sharp dagger-like pimples waiting to rip and tear anything that tried to climb into the paddock from the outside. This was a bad idea, Otto said. In a series of them, Ash said. DePauli sighed long and hard. How the hell did you two even find your way to the Andes? She stormed past them and strode up to the gates. A crossbar lay between two grooves, securing the doors, but there was no lock. She jerked on the handle, pulled up the latch, and slid the long bar out of the locking grooves. The gate swayed and creaked, the right one falling open a crack. Otto took a step back and looked at Ash, who shook his head. DePauli kicked open the gates and got low, scanning the paddock. She waved them on and disappeared through the open gates. Why do I feel like we're at Disney going ride to ride? Otto said. Last ride for the day, Ash said. Suck it up. No speed passes? DePauli said. Ash had no idea what the woman was talking about. Otto sighed and trudged after DePauli. Ash's nerves did somersaults. Otto's observation brought home again that they were being manipulated. They were all playing right into the madman's hands. By structuring things the way he had, Treemont ensured that members of the group would be in certain locations within certain time periods. Treemont had been 2 steps ahead of them the entire way, so there was no reason to believe anything had changed. He or she was watching, waiting. For what? One to rise? All of them to die? But what would the purpose of the whole stupid affair be then? Madness rarely has a purpose. Ash searched his mind for people who might hold a grudge against him, injustices in and out of his control, but he could think of no reason why a stranger might want to kill him. The inside of the paddock was the same as outside, like a Dr. Seuss machine had run through the forest, cutting down trees and spitting the wood fence out its back end. There were no trees close to the wall, but the thin forest extended across the habitat to the rock face where the mountainside turned sharply upward. A large cave mouth stood out on the side of the cliff face like a cockroach atop an ice cream sundae. Insects buzzed and clicked, birds argued and sang, and a gentle breeze rattled leaves and pushed around dusty snow from the shadows that hadn't melted off. Nothing moved in the paddock, everything still and quiet. Let's get up there and out as fast as we can, Ash said. Do we all need to go? Otto said. It might make more sense to leave a guard at the entrance. We could create a signal in case A gunshot echoed off the stone walls of the valley, lingering for several seconds before dying away. The 3 companions stood still, feet frozen to the hardpan, all of them looking over their shoulders toward the house, the direction the sound had come from. That can't be good, DePauli said. Ash shrugged. We should close the gate. And Otto's got a point. Someone keeping watch at the entrance could be helpful. We going to have the same stupid argument each time we have to make a decision? DePauli said. Ash and Otto stared at her wide-eyed. She sighed, loud and hard. Who gets the statue if it's found? Certainly not the person who stays at the gate. She pulled down her knit cap, put her hands on her hips, and stared down Otto, who flinched like a beaten puppy. Let's worry about that when we've got it. I'm going, Ash said. Me also, DePauli said. Otto said nothing, and when Ash didn't start walking, he stormed forward and pushed past his companions, angling up the hillside in the direction of the cave. Ash and DePauli followed. No one spoke as they threaded through the sparse conifers and huge juniper bushes with tiny purple flowers. The scent was oddly therapeutic, and Ash sucked in fresh air, trying to calm his grumbling nerves. A branch cracked, and Ash and Otto paused, DePauli taking Ash's arm. Something big was pushing through the forest. The creature's harsh, erratic breathing like a large engine about to stall. Trees swayed and bent, branches snapped and popped. The trio stayed still within the shadows of a large evergreen, waiting for the beast to pass. Ash's heart galloped, pain shooting through his chest to the tips of his fingers. If the thing smelled them the way the Sasquatch had, they were all dead. He pulled his karambit from a pocket and opened it with a flick of the wrist. The fiberglass blade glinted dully in the failing light, but Ash felt better with the weapon in his hand. The creature moved away, the sounds of its retreat faded, and Ash let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "That was close," Otto said. "Any idea what direction it was going in?" Ash asked. Nobody answered. Ash could take a guess where the beast was going as night approached, but he didn't want to think about it. Rocks slid and cracked, and miniature landslides of gravel and sand pushed the small party backward as they tried to scale the hillside. Small birds wheeled overhead, watching and occasionally yelling at the companions as they trekked. Ash thought of the Cribane from the Fellowship of the Ring, how the dark cloud of birds could be seen miles away. Was Treemont watching the birds with the knowledge they were marking Ash's location? That couldn't have been planned, but like finding a dead body in the desert, it was never a bad idea to follow the birds if you were looking for something dead, or alive. Ash threaded through rocks and boulders on an animal path worn into the hardpan. Devil grass and weeds lined the path, the forest falling away as the hillside got steeper. Natural stone steps led up to a plateau that stretched before the cave mouth and overlooked the valley. The view was amazing. Ash saw the house and the lake beyond, the monument, its spotlight waiting for moonlight. Ash strained to see, but he thought he saw a figure walking around the side of the house, but it was too far to be certain. Bones, blood stains, and dried fat and gristle coated the stone before the cave entrance. It looked like the entry to a troll den. Ash pulled his flashlight and flicked it on, panning the light around the inside of the cave. Rocks and boulders lined the walls, and when Ash shined his light upward, the beam disappeared into darkness. A thin trail of black dots, dried blood by the looks of it, led into the cave. Deepali and Otto pulled their lights, and Ash said, "Hold off for now. One should be enough. We don't want to alert the world, and I don't want to get stuck in there with no light if my batteries die." Deepali nodded and dropped the light back into her bag. Ash flipped the karambit on his finger, the blade singing through the air as he inched forward into the cave. He wrinkled his nose as he was assaulted by the scent of rot and decay. Paw prints, bone shards, and dried fat covered the floor, but no sound came from within. He paused and looked back. "Someone should stay at the entrance and keep watch, in case the thing shows." "I know, I'll stay," Otto said, no hesitation. Deepali and Ash went on, moving slowly around boulders and piles of rubble. "I'm surprised you're so open to exploration," Ash whispered, but his voice still rang in the tunnel like he'd screamed. "Why is that? Because I'm a woman?" she said. Ash chuckled. "For real? You know damn well it has nothing to do with you being a woman and everything to do with you not wanting to play Tremont's game." "This isn't about Treemont or his game," she said. "What the hell is it about then?" Ash said. "You just don't get it, do you? For some of us, cryptids didn't destroy our lives. They're not the reason we're miserable, or see ourselves as failures. We do that all on our own." Ash didn't understand, but he was smart enough to keep his mouth shut. "I'm here for the beasts. That's the only reason I came in the first place. The chance to see some of the creatures I've dreamed about most of my life. Take care of them. Study the world's most unique creatures up close." Ash said nothing, his flashlight beam bouncing off the stone walls as he trudged forward. "Ido said he'd seen a Yeren. You know what that is?" Deepali said. "A beast from the Orient someplace," Ash said. "I didn't know that was his thing." The shadow of Deepali's head nodded. "It's not, wasn't, really. But he said the thing resembled a giant bear, and there's been numerous accounts around the world of similar creatures. To actually see one, be able to verify something that the cryptid community has been trying to find for more than 100 years? Don't you care about that? Or is it all still about you proving you're not crazy?" Deepali's lecture made Ash think of Ido, and sorrow seeped through him. The image of the massive spider dropping on top of the man, flattening the life out of him. That sound, the pop, snap, and crunch of Ido's body being broken, would haunt his sleep forever, as would Augie's screams and Emika's eyes. Leaving out Snake made Ash run through all the possible scenarios again. The pair reached a fork in the cave and they stopped to drink water. The passage on the left appeared to plunge downward into blackness, but the cool air that pumped through the opening smelled fresh and earthy. The cave on the right was rank and smelled of rotting meat and festering wounds. Ash and DePauli went left. The plop and tap of water dripping and the hiss and squeak of bats filled the cave. Ash angled the flashlight up, light spilling over the ceiling. Thousands of bats hung on and around stalactites of various lengths and thicknesses. The flock of bats undulated and swayed as one, wings flexing under the light. Ash pointed the flashlight at the ground, and the bats settled down, packed like bees on a rough ceiling.
"The tunnel is getting narrow,"
DePauli said.
"We couldn't see the ceiling when we first entered."
Ash realized that. He also realized the walls were slowly closing in on the duo as they pressed forward, the tunnel plunging downward into colder air. The floor was slick, and water ran down the cave walls. Bugs and worms slithered and shifted in the darkness, the tapping of their feet like a swarm of cockroaches.
"Is that a light?"
DePauli said. Ash halted and flicked off the flashlight. Blackness filled the cave, a dark nothingness so complete Ash couldn't see his hand 5 inches from his face. In the distance, a speck of green light leaked down the tunnel. But it was so far away, Ash didn't know if he was actually seeing a light or if it was his mind wanting to see something that wasn't there.
"Come on,"
DePauli said. The pounding of her footfalls as she hurried through the cave echoed off the walls, her bracelets tinkling. A warning bell sounded in the back of Ash's mind, that primal alarm that told you something wasn't right, no matter how clear the path was. "Careful!" Ash yelled. His call bounced around the cave and fell dead. DePauli's flashlight clicked on. She was about 50 yards down the tunnel. She put the beam on Ash and said,
"There's definitely something there. Come on."
"Slow up," Ash said. "There might be traps, holes, who knows what." DePauli skidded to a stop. When Ash arrived at her side, she snapped off her light.
"See it?"
The green light had grown to a small rough circle, but it was still far off. Behind them, a faint grumble resounded through the cave. Ash stopped and listened hard, eliminating the dripping water, the breeze, and the incessant screech and tap of bugs, but the grumble was gone. They doubled their pace, and the team of 2 covered the remaining 200 yards quickly. Green light emanated from a jade statue. The likeness of the giant bear with ferocious teeth and long claws outstretched sat atop a stone, light shining up through the statue and illuminating the chamber with pale green light. The room was roughly spherical, and if Ash didn't know better, he would have guessed the chamber had been formed by a lava bubble, but that was impossible. Yet what did that really mean, impossible? He learned in the last 48 hours that nothing was impossible. The grumble was back and footfalls drummed through the cave. "Let's get that thing and get out of here," Ash said.
"Wait 1 second,"
DePauli said.
"You warned me, now let me warn you. Be careful."
She turned on her flashlight and scanned the floor, but there were no traps or impediments. The statue sat atop a roughly hewn pillar of cave stone, a light glowing from within and pushing through the jade figurine.
"How do you figure that light is powered?"
DePauli said as she examined the walls and ceiling. "A battery or fuel cell of some kind. Treemont did know when we'd be here, after all. He could have sent Rogers up here," Ash said. He hadn't thought about the bot in hours. The little tin can could be 2 steps behind, watching them. A fierce roar echoed through the chamber, a loud booming cry of anger that made Ash and DePauli spin and shine their flashlights down the tunnel. A massive bear-like creature lumbered into view, walking on 2 short legs, all rippling muscles and dark fur, 2 long, thick fangs hanging from a mouth filled with knife-like teeth. The beast filled the tunnel as it attacked. Ash looked at the glowing statue, then back at the creature as it charged. He sighed. Great. Just great. 23. Ash searched the chamber for another way out, but found none. The giant bear barreled down the tunnel, galloping on 4 legs, head low, jaws distended. Ash darted toward the statue, daggers of green light cutting through the gloom, his flashlight beam dancing, shadows writhing. Fear oozed into him like a cancer, but he was already in motion, and there was no other way out anyway. Dipali screamed and pressed her back to the wall next to the tunnel mouth. That was smart. The beast would come roaring into the chamber, run right past her, then she could slip away down the tunnel while Ash tangled with the beast. He reached the statue, the roar of the creature echoing through the tunnel. It was close, but Ash didn't look back. He scanned the glowing jade statue of the bear, looking for traps. His mind flashed back to his adolescence. He'd seen Raiders of the Lost Ark 16 times in the theater, and as he stood before the jade figurine, he saw the gold monkey head and the giant rock chasing Indy through the tunnel. The bear burst into the chamber, raking the walls with its claws, roaring and growling as it rose on two legs, arms out like a boxer. In his peripheral vision, Ash saw Dipali slip behind the beast and disappear into the dark tunnel beyond. She didn't look back. At least Ash didn't need to worry about the woman now. Had that been the plan all along, to leave Ash alone, trapped inside the mountain with a creature he couldn't hope to beat in a fight? He yanked the statue from its stone pedestal, dropped it in a pocket, and turned to face the creature. The giant bear swung at Ash with its massive paw, 2-inch curved claws at the end of each digit. Ash feinted back like Neo in the Matrix, the scratches on his chest pulling on their scabs, the beast's claws passing inches from his face. Ash spun on the tips of his toes like a ballerina, pirouetting and slamming the side of the creature's head with his flashlight as he pulled his karambit and flicked it open. The beast reeled, bringing up its paws to protect its head, but Ash was faster. He spun again, the karambit singing, the blade slicing across the beast's forearms. The cryptid howled as pain brought the creature to its knees. It clutched its wounds, whimpered, but then appeared to get its second wind. The mutant bear turned its black, glassy eyes on Ash as it pushed itself to its feet, blood dripping from its wounds. Ash turned off the flashlight, and the cave fell into partial darkness, the faint light that had illuminated the jade statue still sending a cloud of pale green light through the darkness that spilled across the chamber. Flight or fight? Ash turned the flashlight on and off several times in fast succession, strobing light into the creature's eyes as it came at him. Ash ran straight at the creature, the two on a collision course that would break Ash in half. The bear swung its immense paw, and Ash dodged, veering sharply and slipping beneath the beast's outstretched arm. As he passed the bear, Ash lashed out with the karambit, slashing the back of the creature's leg. The beast bucked and heaved, reaching out for Ash as it fell to a knee. Ash cut into the tunnel and turned it on. He was 42, not out of shape, but certainly not fit. He was 12,000 feet up, where the air was as thin as a sparrow's fart, and Ash's lungs burned after 20 strides, pain cutting across his chest, his scratches pulling and shifting. He slowed, sucking for air, but he didn't stop. Grunts, growls, and roars chased Ash up the tunnel, but he heard no footfalls. He spun the karambit on his finger as he jogged, looking over his shoulder every few seconds. Darkness pressed in on him, his head pounding in rhythm with his heart like when he had a fever. Discomfort inched through every joint like maggots, his throat dry and sore, stomach aching with stabs of pain. He reached the fork in the tunnel and found Dipali waiting.
Are you all right?
She said. Ash didn't stop jogging, though he'd slowed to a turtle's pace.
Let's go.
Ash's flashlight dimmed and blinked out. He slowed and waited for Dipali to light her candle. When light blossomed through the tunnel again, Ash pulled back his arm, intent on hurling the dead light into the stone wall and watching it break, but something held him back, some survival instinct learned long ago and deeply buried. He had nothing, so even an unusable flashlight might serve an unforeseen purpose. The duo ran on through the cave, the ceiling giving way to deep blackness above. The commotion had stirred the bats, and the flying rats darted and flew around the cave, several dive-bombing Ash and Dipali as they ran. The beasts didn't like direct light, and Dipali worked her light like a gun, putting the flashlight's beam on any creature that came near. "You need help?" Otto called through the cave. The cave walls fell away, and the massive cavern that opened onto the mountainside stretched out before them. Ash didn't stop, and he jogged past Otto and punched him on the shoulder. "What the hell was that for?" Otto said. Dipali yelled.
What were you doing out here? Napping? You were supposed to warn us if the beast showed. How did it get by you? Did you hide?
Otto stared at the woman, his mouth falling open. Ash put his hand on Otto's shoulder and he flinched. You okay? What happened? Why didn't you warn us? As the questions rolled from Ash's tongue, a horrible thought burrowed into him like a tapeworm. Otto is Treemont, and he didn't expect to see Ash and DePolly again. Otto blinked, but said nothing. You awake? Hello? DePolly said. I didn't see anything, Otto said. I was here the entire time. I heard some commotion down the tunnel, but I stayed here. You were attacked? Give me that flashlight, Ash said, and DePolly handed over the light. Ash searched the floor, scanning the ground in the tunnel, then moving out onto the precipice that reached out over the valley. The ground was stained with blood, dried fat and gristle, and shards of bones. There were paw prints everywhere, and it was impossible to distinguish new from old. A more experienced tracker might have been able to discern something, but he couldn't. You don't believe me? Otto said. I don't believe anything anymore, Ash said. Let's go before that thing sneaks up on us. There must be another way in, Otto said. Did you see side passages? Any sign where it may have come in from? The fork in the tunnel filled Ash's mind's eye, but he said nothing. The trio climbed back down to the valley floor the way they'd come, darkness settling over the forest, the day chorus giving way to the night symphony. A faint orange-white glow leaked over the western rim of the valley as the sun sank below the rim of the world. Another night had come to the Atavism Special Animal Sanctuary, and the party was down to 5, as far as Ash knew. Sean and Candace could already be dead. When the small party arrived at the tall set of double wood doors, one stood slightly ajar, shifting with each push of the wind. The latch was open, and the board that fell into the locking grooves and secured the doors had been removed. No beast did that, Otto said. Nope, Ash said as he flicked his wrist, spun the karambit on his index finger, and used the momentum to snap the blade closed. He slipped it into a pocket without DePolly noticing. Otto was a different matter. His eyes locked on the pocket where Ash had dropped the knife, then they shifted to his other pocket which contained the statue. Otto said, You find the statue? Yep, Ash said. DePolly stared at Ash, waiting for him to spill the entire story. Had DePolly seen him take the statue? She certainly hadn't seen him put it in his pocket. She'd been hightailing it down the tunnel, saving her own ass. Ash said nothing. And? Otto said. Where is it? Ash did his best to feign sorrow, and he looked back forlornly at the animal path, then up at the dark opening that marked the cave mouth. You don't have it, DePolly shrieked. Bull turd, that's the biggest pile of American shit I've ever heard. She stalked through the open gate, then realized she was alone and turned around and came back. She stood behind Otto, arms crossed, foot tapping. Otto looked back at her, then at Ash as he lifted his eyebrows. There'd been a shift in allegiance, but Ash didn't care. Otto, either knowing he had no right to the statue anyway, so what was the point fighting, or sensing he'd lose a fight with Ash if he pressed the issue, decided to do nothing. So that's it then, DePolly said. What do you have in your pockets? A box without hinges, key, or lid, but golden treasure inside is hid, Ash said. Otto chuckled. The wind pushed around his hair and dirt marred his face. Look, I don't understand your redneck language, okay? DePolly said. Otto and Ash laughed. Redneck? Ash said. I don't think that word means what you think it means, Otto said. I believe the insult you're looking for is geek, Ash said. DePolly shook her head and planted her hands on her hips. Gollum? The Hobbit? Didn't your ma or pa ever read you The Hobbit? Otto said. Sure. Short people with furry feet, a magic ring, a dragon, so the hell what? Ash said. Forget it. The trio left the paddock, and Ash found a large dead branch and used it to secure the gates. The dead tree limb wouldn't last under sustained pounding, but it might slow the creature down. While searching for the large branch, Ash and Otto found 3 sticks they made into staffs by stripping away small sucker branches. Blackness pressed in as the companions worked their way through the forest, sticking to the path, DePolly's flashlight beam cutting through the murkiness. Otto hadn't brought out his light, but he did offer up the last of his water. Ash had the feeling he was being watched. He'd felt that way continuously since arriving in the valley, but it was stronger now than ever. Something stalked them from the shadows. "Let's take a break for a second," Ash said. "If you need it," Otto said as he took the final pull of his water. Topali jerked to a halt, bracelets clanging. "Jesus," Ash snapped. "You're like a constant alarm." Both men stared at Topali. When Topali ignored them, Ash said, "Topali, kill your light for a second." She sighed louder, but complied. Ash dropped into a crouch, scanning the forest behind them the way they'd come. "What the hell?" Otto said. "Be quiet. Just act normal, like we're taking a break," Ash said.
We are taking a break,
Topali said. Anger surged in Ash, but he beat it back, taking a deep breath and rolling his shoulders. Moonlight cut through the tree canopy, and shadows danced under every branch, behind every stone, and next to every bush. The forest shifted and swayed, the gentle breeze pushing around dead leaves, brown pine needles, and the occasional small tornado of snow. Ash went tree to tree with his eyes, going slow, focusing. There was something there. He could feel its presence, but he couldn't see it. This went on for several minutes before Topali clicked her light back on and started for the house.
You boys have fun. I think I'm done for the night.
Ash said nothing, Topali's flashlight beam bouncing around in the darkness. "We're gonna let her walk up there alone, in the dark?" Otto said. Ash shook his head as he started after her. The trio didn't speak as they threaded their way to the yellow path that led to the front of the house. They entered the atrium, the fresh scent of water and earth assailing them. Moonlight slanted through the glass windows, and the slick green leaves of tropical plants shined as if wet. The table at the center of the atrium stood empty. The house beyond was quiet. The trio moved through the atrium into the house, and Ash closed the door behind him. He said, "Anyone getting food?" Topali didn't answer. She climbed the steps without a word, leaving Ash and Otto standing alone in the foyer. "What the hell do you think that thing out there really was?" Otto said. Ash was surprised at the sudden question. "Well, you heard the description. Could it be Ito's Yeren?" Otto raised an eyebrow. "You knew about that?" "Topali told me." "Could be a Yeren, an Ozark howler, many different things. As I think of all the cryptids listed in the Sanctuary Library, creatures resembling giant bears are the most common. Makes sense, right? I mean, to someone who's never seen a grizzly bear in the right light, the big ones look scary. Odd fur coloring is easy to explain." Ash rubbed his forehead. "It's all just so crazy, you know? I thought I'd seen all the crazy there was. Apparently I didn't know shit." Otto laughed. "You know you need something to eat. Let's go." There was cold ham on a platter with bread, potato salad with vinegar, and bread that had long gone cold. There were bottles of wine on the sidebar with pitchers of water, but Rogers was nowhere to be found, and when Ash called, the bot didn't come. "Sean's right about that tin can," Ash said. "I could really use a martini." The two men ate in silence, and when they were done, they went up to their rooms. The house creaked and moaned in the silence, and Ash thought he heard classical music playing far off, maybe in one of the rooms. The duo got to the top of the steps and paused. Then Ash did something on impulse, something he didn't exactly understand. He pulled the statue of the giant bear from a pocket and showed it to Otto. "A piece of this is yours," he said. Ash expected a wry comment, a cynical account of how that would work, but instead Otto nodded, headed down the hall, and disappeared into his room. Ash stood before his door, glancing up and down the hallway. He was going back down into the maze, but it was important to keep up appearances. He tapped in his code and entered his room, letting the door click closed behind him. He'd give his companions time to go to sleep, then he'd find a way out of the valley. 24. Ash searched his room, but nothing appeared out of place. The water in his basin was cool, but there was a clean towel and decanter of wine on the washstand. He poured a glass of vino and went out onto the terrace, the faint glow of the atrium below, moonlight knifing across the forest. Clouds fleeted past, the chill breeze pushing out the remainder of the storm. Bright, clear patches of star-filled sky stood out in the clouds. When Ash saw a true clear sky, he was always amazed at how much light pollution there was. Even Stony Creek, where the northern Californian climate produced clear skies, didn't compare to stargazing at 12,000 feet. Something howled, and Ash went to the railing and leaned over it, the sharp edge biting into his stomach. Nothing moved along the house. Everything was dark shadows and stillness. He tossed back his wine and went to get another, but froze. Sean stood watching him from his balcony. Ash waved. Sean disappeared back into his room without a sign. He went inside, blew out the candles, flicked off the single light, and sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness facing the door. The house creaked and moaned, but the place was made of stone. Conversation and footfalls traveled, and he'd hear anyone who came down the hall, even Rogers. Rogers, where had that bot got to? It had disappeared at the perfect time. Emeka's death, suspicion, and mistrust among the players. Perhaps he should have let Sean take its head off, but would it matter? Treemont could have 3 spares, or 100. Was that the failsafe if things went bad? If players revolted? Bots with guns? Ash took off his boots, tied them together by the laces, and set them aside. Then he rolled his jacket like a sleeping bag with his gloves, hat, clothes, flashlight, and karambit inside. Ash wrapped the lace-connected boots around the jacket to make a tight ball. He rummaged through his rucksack and retrieved black long underwear and socks, which he slipped into. He collected his bundle and padded silently across the room, barely lifting his feet off the slick wood floor. Ash eased through the half-open door onto the balcony and dropped his package over the railing. It hit the ground below with a faint smack and puff. He waited, watching to see if lights came on, or if people came out onto the terraces to investigate. Everything was still. Static ran down Ash's spine, and he jumped, trying to shake the feeling. Was it good or bad? It appeared nobody had heard his little drop. Ash was underestimating these people, and he needed to stop. Sean was probably watching him even now, from the shadows of his balcony. No matter, what was done was done. He slipped back into his room, closed the door, but left it unlocked. Ivy grew on the side of the house, and in a pinch, Ash might be able to climb to his balcony. Like the flashlight, when you've got nothing, you must use everything. Out in the hallway, Ash took extra care, holding the lock open as he slowly eased the door closed. The faint click and beep was unavoidable, so he moved fast, running down the hall in the darkness like a ghost. When he got to the top of the steps, he plunged down, stopping 5 steps down. He lay on the steps with his chin above the second-floor landing, watching the hallway in both directions. Nothing. He stood and jumped down the remaining steps 2 at a time, trying to make a little noise, let them know he wasn't sneaking. The sitting room was dark, as was the kitchen and dining room, but there was salami, tongue, cheese, bread, and water on the sideboard. Ash took a plate, grabbed some cheese, bread, and a bottle of wine and sat at the table to wait. 15 minutes passed. Ash ate, drank, waited. Nobody came, not even Otto. "Rogers?" Ash called. The faint chatter of the night chorus and the distant thrum of the house filled the room. Moonlight angled across the valley like spotlights, thin, tattered clouds streaking across the sky. Rogers didn't come. He could hide, watch the kitchen. The bot eventually had to return there. So far, it had kept to its promise of food being available at all times. That was, if things didn't change. Ash poured another glass of wine and knocked it back fast. What if food was somehow withheld? Then what? Would they kill the creatures of the valley for food? Could they? They had the 6 bullets, well, maybe 5 if it had been Sean's shot they'd heard that afternoon. Things had escalated steadily since they'd arrived, and there was no reason to believe that wouldn't continue. After an hour, Ash wandered the first floor of the house, looking in closets, searching the kitchen cabinets. To his amazement, he found batteries, a pack of 6 new D-cells, the size needed for the flashlight. The euphoria of the jackpot didn't last long because, as he'd feared, the food locker was locked, as was the ice box, a large walk-in type cold box with an area beneath the floor for ice. A pipe came up through the floor and was cold to the touch. the house's geothermal heating and cooling system doing its job. The door leading to the basement was locked, but Ash could pick it easily when the time came. All he needed was a fork with all its prongs bent back except one, and there was plenty of forks. Ash stopped in the sitting room for a few minutes, then disappeared down the back hallway. He pressed his back to the wall. He could almost feel the camera lenses focusing in on him. When he was comfortable, nobody was following. He pulled off his socks, cracked open the back door, and slipped into the cold night, leaving the door slightly ajar. His feet stung as he sprinted around the side of the house to where his jacket and boots waited. As it turned out, the precaution wasn't necessary, but if he'd been followed, walking around in his long underwear was more defendable than if he'd been bundled up like he was making an attempt to summit Everest. He collected his bundle and sprinted back to the house. It was cold now, well below freezing, and the ground was slick. Ash's lungs stung, but he picked up his pace, wanting to get back in the house so he could get dressed. When Ash reached the back door, he found it locked. He stood dazed as he searched the house's windows for any signs of life. He slipped on his clothes, pulled on his socks and boots, and encased himself in a warm cocoon. Nothing moved on the thin patch of field that separated the house from the forest. Above, the veranda where they'd all met, shared stories and drinks, stood silent and dark. He felt the karambit through the fabric of his pants and was reassured. He loaded the flashlight with new batteries and dropped the 4 spares into a back pocket. Ash worked his way around the house to the north, passing under Sean's balcony and moving around to the front of the atrium. There was a notch where the atrium melded into the foyer of the house, and Ash slipped into it, blending into the darkness like a wraith. He stood still as stone, watching the way he'd come. Nothing. Ash was starting to feel the fool. He felt like he was being watched constantly. But maybe nobody gave a shit what he did, where he went. Problem was, he just couldn't sell himself that. It was possible the back door got blown closed in the wind, but the wind couldn't have locked it. 10 minutes slid by, the cold biting into Ash, and when nobody showed, he inched along the outside of the atrium toward the entrance. He'd only gone a few steps when he tripped. Something lay on the ground in the darkness. Moonlight reflected off the atrium's glass windows, and as Ash bent to see what was on the ground, he jerked back and fell to the hardpan. A beast that looked half man, half wolf lay dead, a thin coating of frost covering the corpse's gray hair. It looked to have walked on 2 long, jointed legs with claws, its arms short and lanky. White film covered dark eyes, a long snout extending off the beast's face and ending in a white nose. A dark bullet hole marred the center of the creature's chest, a frozen patch of blood covering the ice-covered fur. In the moonlight, it felt as though the corpse watched him, waiting to come alive and chomp Ash with the razor-sharp teeth glinting within its powerful jaws. A cough echoed off the house, a faint exhalation that was barely discernible above the push of the wind. Ash rose and pressed himself to the side of the atrium, staring into the forest. Trees swayed and leaves rattled. An owl hooted 5 times, louder each time as if saying, "Humans, go to bed, you're drunk." Ash waited still as the seconds ticked by, then minutes. A tall shadow appeared at the edge of the forest, a slender figure with a long snout and gangly legs. The shadow eased along the edge of the woods, then disappeared. Ash gathered his courage to follow, but he put his back to the wall again when Otto came around the side of the house, all his attention focused on where the shadow had disappeared into the forest. Ash pulled his flashlight but didn't follow. He waited, the night symphony serenading him until he felt enough time had gone by. He darted across the open area between the house and the woods, hiding behind a thick tree trunk and scanning the forest. He couldn't see Otto, but the man's fresh footprints were easy to find in the thin coating of frost that covered everything in the valley as the moisture from the storm cooled. The prints trailed away to the east, following the edge of the woods around the northern side of the garden with the monument at its center. Otto's prints were joined by a second, much thinner and larger set of prints. Otto had found the creature's trail, or had the beast found his? Ash wanted to turn on the flashlight and scan the ground, look for clues, but that would alert everyone in the valley to his position. The tracks turned sharply south, cutting across the wide cone of light created by moonlight shining through the giant ring at the top of the monument. The light currently fell on the northern slope, just east of the bear paddock. There was nothing there. A scream ahead, a pop and a crack. Ash picked up his pace, looking back over his shoulder every few moments, cognizant of the fact that this could be a trap. There was a roar, then a slap and tear like meat being torn from bone. A hiss rose above the wind, and the chirp and buzz of insects fell away. He pulled up short when he came around a huge juniper bush, sharp leaves biting his face, small berries squishing against his cheek. Two lone figures stood in the moonlight, silhouetted before the giant stone monument. One was clearly Otto. He was the smaller figure hanging from the creature's claws. Ash inched forward until he was 30 feet away and flicked on the flashlight. The beast he'd seen the prior day, the Jersey Devil with its wings clipped, bent over Otto, pulling pieces of flesh from his torso and throwing back his head, tossing the chunks of meat down his gullet. The creature froze under the harsh glare of the flashlight, dark blood dripping down its narrow chin, fat and skin stuck in its long teeth. It dropped what was left of Otto and turned its shining yellow eyes on Ash. He shuddered, worry, fear, and pain pulsing through him like an electrical shock. His eyes went wide, the scratches on his chest throbbing in rhythm with his heart. Time slowed, the wind died away, and the insect symphony hadn't returned from break. When the creature spoke, Ash's mouth fell open a crack, and though he wanted to turn and run, his brain just wouldn't issue the order. "What's it that you want?" The voice was snake-like, and it slithered from the creature's lips like a maggot into rotten meat. Ash said nothing as he slowly backed away, his brain finally catching up with his flight-or-fight instinct. Whether this thing was a Jersey Devil or not meant nothing to him, and Dipali's speech ran through his mind as the beast inched forward. "It understands." It was calling Ash it. How quaint. Ash turned off the flashlight, plunging the area around the atrium into semi-darkness. Moonlight knifed across the clearing as he backed away, slipping under a bush, his gaze constantly shifting to Otto's fallen form where it lay crumpled on the hardpan. The devil's long shadow fell across the tree line as it came at Ash, long arms and legs becoming one as they churned and the creature picked up its pace. Ash ran, not looking back, arms and legs pumping as his lungs fought for oxygen. He'd try and make the front door. If it was locked, he crossed that bridge when he came to it. His lungs burned as he struggled for air, pain lancing his knees. He spared a glance over his shoulder and didn't see the creature, but Ash didn't slow. Sweat dripped down his back, his heart in overdrive, head pounding. He rounded the front corner of the atrium and everything was still and quiet. He skidded to a stop and pulled on the door handle, and to Ash's relief, the door opened, and he passed inside. The atrium was quiet, and Ash stood there panting, waiting for the door to shudder and shake as the beast tried to get in. But the door didn't move, and only the wind howled. Ash strode quickly through the atrium toward the front door, but he paused when a strange glint from outside caught his eye. He worked his way through a series of tropical potted plants to the glass wall of the atrium. It had only been an hour since he'd left his room, and he'd already had enough. He stared through the glass at the corpse of the strange beast, heart thumping. The creature's eyes were open, and it looked to Ash as though the dead beast was smiling at him. 5. Nerves crackling and stretching, ears ringing, stomach aching with angst, Ash slipped into the house and left Otto behind. He didn't like the idea of leaving the man's body to be eaten, but without a weapon, he didn't think risking his life made sense, given there was no way he could bring Otto back. He was gone beyond this world, and they were down to 4. The idea that Otto might be carrying his statue poked its evil head above Ash's barrier of rationality, but was quickly batted down. He stood in the foyer, blackness leaking from the sitting room. There was no fire and no lights burned. 4 of the 9 were left. What was the 5th verse of the damnable poem? Temple thy dreams with the trees, nature thy God alone, worship the sun and the breeze, altars where none atone. Had Otto atoned? If so, for what? The house creaked and popped as if speaking, but it wasn't the sound of footsteps or movement. It was 100 years of cut blue granite pressing on the earth, stretching the wood-paneled walls and the thick floor joists. Ash was paralyzed with indecision. The last hour had taken most of the wind from his sails. Should he go on or go to bed? He was very tired, but he didn't think he'd be able to sleep. So the choice was go back to his room and waste time staring at his dark ceiling or press forward. There was time to sleep when he was dead. He rolled his shoulders. Bad analogy. He took one step and the corresponding creak and pop froze Ash in place. There was a bump and rattle from upstairs, perhaps a door closing. He slipped off his boots and tiptoed through the sitting room, past the kitchen and dining room to the hallway beyond. He paused, a shadow moving at the end of the hall by the door to the basement stairwell. A tinkle, like tiny wind chimes twisting in a gentle breeze, floated down the hall. Ash moved quickly, keeping tight to the wall, head low. The floor popped so loudly it sounded like a gunshot in the stillness, and Ash froze. The shadowy figure spun.
Who's there? I've got Sean's gun.
Ash's abs hurt from containing his laughter. It was DePauli, and that was 20 kinds of bullshit. Or was it? For all he knew, Candace and Sean could be dead. He dropped to the ground like he'd been asked to do push-ups, then lowered himself onto his stomach. He lay still on the hallway floor, eyes up and watching DePauli. She didn't move. Her dark form easy to see from Ash's angle on the floor, moonlight leaking into the passageway from the open kitchen door. Ash and DePauli stayed that way for a long time, wind pushing at the house, owls hooting and night birds singing. Ash was just starting to cramp when he heard DePauli rummaging around in her bag. If she pulled a light, he'd be seen. So what? What could she do? A pinprick of light knifed through the darkness at the end of the hall. Metal scraped on metal. A thin cone of light was focused on the basement door lock. Shadows of DePauli's hands furiously working the lock danced on the wall, the woman's bracelets jingling. Picking a lock is hard. Doing it in the dark was harder. But again, Ash grudgingly gave the woman respect. If she turned on a flashlight, half the valley would see its glow in the deep of night. What was DePauli up to? Why did she want to go into the basement? It was nasty, cold, and dark, and Candace had shared much of their adventure in the blackness with most of the group. DePauli knew there was a Yeti-type creature prowling the tunnels, and she knew Ash hadn't found a way out. That told him one of two things. One, she didn't believe what Candace had said and he and Sean had confirmed. Or B, she knew something he didn't. Was DePauli, for all her, "we're in a fight for our lives," still playing the game or just looking for a way out like he was? Or was DePauli Treemont? A creature roared outside. It sounded like a Sasquatch to Ash. He silently chuckled to himself. That was his world now, where he could recognize cryptids by their native calls. That guy sounded angry. The click of the door lock opening echoed down the hallway. The thin light blinked out, the door creaked open, and DePauli disappeared through it. Ash pressed himself to his feet like a surfer getting up on a long board, and he was kneeling beside the door before it clicked closed. He grabbed the knob and turned it so the bolt was drawn back and held it as the door closed. Then a tap and a click of the lock being turned as DePauli secured the door, the faint sound of footfalls as she retreated down the steps. Ash's wrist hurt. He still had the doorknob twisted to the open position, so though DePauli had locked it on her side, the locking mechanism wouldn't engage until he released the door handle and let the bolt insert into the striker plate. He eased the door open a crack and waited. his hand aching from the pressure of holding back the lock bolt. When his forearm spasmed, he eased open the door and slipped through, releasing the handle and letting the door close with a tap and click. He stood still in the blackness. He felt the karambit and batteries in his back pocket, the flashlight in his jacket. He listened hard, but all he heard was dripping water, the thrum of the house, and the faint singing wind. The steps were made of wood, and when he got to the bottom, Ash put his boots back on, lacing them up quickly as he sat on the steps in the darkness. The maze wasn't so much a maze, but a disorganized mess of tunnels that had grown and changed with the house. Old storage rooms, root cellars, and a variety of chambers with bars like prison cells. There were accounts in the sanctuary library about the early days of bringing and acclimating animals to the valley. The cells had been used as a transition tool. The two stumps where the Jersey Devil's wings had been cut off seemed like a pretty severe transition tool to Ash. He stumbled upon DePolly's flashlight beam as she backtracked to the staircase. She hadn't been with Ash, Sean, and Candace when they'd ventured into the basement the first time, so Ash figured she was lost. He hid behind a stack of old crates that had markings on them Ash couldn't understand. The language looked like Arabic. DePolly cursed, her flashlight beam coming back in Ash's direction. He stayed hidden, keeping an eye on her as she fumbled around in the dark. She was making so much noise, he was sure Rogers or Sean would arrive soon. The woman made no attempt at stealth. But who in their right mind would be down in the tunnels in the middle of the night? Ash suddenly felt the fool for following her. Ash decided to stay ahead of her and darted into the shadows, running down the dark tunnel. Ash knew the passage well. He'd backtracked down it several times his first time in the basement. The glow of DePolly's light blossomed behind Ash as he worked his way around the large boulder that led to the old mining operation. He entered the chamber silently, dropping into a crouch as he scanned the darkness. A sword of light cut through the opening to the tunnel, illuminating a section of the old mine. Ash saw his footprints in the dirt-covered floor. He saw Sean's and Candace's, and the cave was silent, save for the tapping of footfalls which were getting closer. DePolly's flashlight beam cut across the mine, and Ash hid behind the same derailed mining cart he had the first time he'd been forced to hide in the mine. DePolly coughed and sputtered as she entered the chamber, her harsh flashlight beam spilling over the room. Her bracelets jingled as she came forward. A shadow, roughly humanoid in shape, slipped into the room behind her. Ash almost called out, but held his breath. Whatever the shadow was, it was keeping its distance, watching DePolly as Ash was. She got to the center of the chamber and stopped, her sigh of frustration rising above the cold breeze. Her flashlight beam jerked around, shadows danced, and it looked like DePolly had turned around and was heading back to the tunnel she'd come from. A low, gurgling growl froze her feet to the cave floor, and she rocked back. A shadow inched forward and disappeared into darkness. DePolly shined her light around, and Ash heard her panicked breathing, the tinkle of her bracelets. He pointed his flashlight where the shadow had been and turned it on. A cone of light shot across the chamber, leaking into the tunnel beyond, and behind piles of rubble and under old, rusted mining equipment. The white Yeti stood 10 feet tall, its dark red eyes staring defiantly into the light. DePolly stood between them, eyes wide. The beast lunged forward, moving past DePolly and charging toward Ash with incredible speed. But even as the beast's long strides took the Yeti past DePolly, it lashed out with its left hand. DePolly screamed, an ear-splitting wail that sent a chill through Ash. She dropped her flashlight, and it hit the floor with a pop, its beam arcing into the shadows. DePolly's eyes went wide and she coughed, her face covered in blood. She dropped to her knees, then onto her stomach as she fell out of Ash's flashlight beam into darkness. The creature pounded its chest as it came on, screaming and roaring, mouth open, teeth glinting. Ash clicked the light off and darted right, heading for the far door. He looked back only once, but couldn't see DePolly's body in the blackness. More likely her bullet was in her jacket, but it wasn't worth the risk to try and get it. The beast grunted and growled as it pursued him. The tunnel opened up, and Ash felt warm air mixing with the cold. He slowed. The sound of pursuit had faded. Ash hid behind a boulder and waited. The beast could be trying to sneak up on him, trick him into thinking everything was okay. Minutes passed. 10. 15. After half an hour, Ash stood and snapped on his flashlight, scanning the tunnel in both directions. There was nothing but rocks, spider webs, and stone walls. The first time around, Ash and his companions retreated back to the house with their tails between their legs. He looked up and down the tunnel again. He was looking for a way out of the valley, and he knew the passage beyond the mine led to the valley. He pulled his shirt from his pants and put the flashlight beneath his shirt, dulling its beam to a faint orange glow. Ash continued down the tunnel, easing around a chunk of stone that hid the entrance to a narrow passageway. He worked his way through the new cavern slowly, using his small cloud of light to avoid stones and holes. Most of the tunnel Ash trekked through had been formed naturally when the Andes sprouted from the Earth's crust 50 million years ago, but there were spots that had clearly been blasted or chiseled. One such spot was braced with black wood supports that sagged under a century of weight. Ash pulled the light from under his shirt and shined its full strength down the narrow shaft. The beam disappeared into blackness. Warmer air pushed from the passageway, and the faint scent of sulfur. He focused the light down the narrow tunnel and went on, staying close to the rock wall. No bugs crawled on the floor, no water dripped. The tunnel was silent save for the whistling of the breeze. Piles of sand dotted the floor under gaps in the shored-up ceiling. The floor was chiseled stone, and his boots tapped and clicked with each footfall. He'd gone 50 yards when the flashlight beam illuminated a natural cavern beyond. The imaginary mice stopped digging into his shoulders as he passed from the man-made tunnel into the open space. The space was empty save for several large boulders and an old crate that was nothing but a pile of hinges, a latch, and decayed wood. He went on for what seemed like hours, the cavern expanding and contracting like lungs, the floor tilting, shards of stone spiking from the floor and walls. He slowed when he saw the blasting cylinder grooves running along the cave walls. The passageway narrowed to a 3-foot-wide crack in the mountain, a heavy coating of rubble covering the floor. Ash stuck his light into the passage, and something glinted at its end. Stone angling away into darkness above. As he approached the end of the tunnel, the glint turned into a reflection, and Ash arrived at the end of the passage to find a metal door blocking his path. The doorframe was set into the stone, big lag bolts and rivets holding the steel in place. 2 large hinges were mounted onto the rock, a metal rod running between them and holding the door in position. A circular door handle like a captain's boat wheel sat in the middle of the rectangular door, a key lock with a cover over it at its center. There were no lights or switches, and as he examined the door, Ash realized it wasn't very old. He traced the outline of the door with his index finger, looking for a gap, but there was none. It had taken someone a great amount of time and effort to put the door in place. But why? The answer to that question was all too clear. Once in the valley, you weren't meant to leave. Ash placed the flashlight on the ground, using a stone to angle the beam upward and grip the door handle. He strained to turn it, jerking and pulling on the slick metal. It didn't budge. Anger and frustration simmered within him. He'd been bested around every turn, and if it weren't for the incompetence of his fellow prisoners, he might already be dead. He screamed, pounding on the door, the metal booming. He'd had enough. He was done. Ash picked up the flashlight and examined the door again, taking a mental picture. He headed back through the cavern the way he'd come. He went extra slow and quiet when he passed the entrance to the mine, not wanting to alert the Yeti, and his thoughts drifted to Dipali and her crumpled body that lay in the chamber beyond. That wasn't his problem. Finding a way to get that door open, that was his problem. 26. Ash made his way through the basement in the blackness, slowly easing around corners, being silent. The house creaked and moaned, but he heard no footsteps or other signs of life. In one of the storage rooms, he found an old crate still filled with its coconut fiber packing material, and he climbed in and pulled the box's lid into place. His breathing echoed in the confined space, and he leaned his head on the box's side and closed his eyes. He needed to catch some sleep. His circadian clock was fairly accurate, and he could usually set the alarm in his head. But he was exhausted, and he worried that once he fell asleep, he'd be like Rip Van Winkle. His head galloped, and he took deep breaths, trying to ease his nerves, which were doing jumping jacks on his spine. Things had gone south so fast, he was having trouble keeping it all straight. Otto's death, then DePauli. Weariness overtook him, and he fell asleep. He woke in darkness, bladder screaming, coconut fiber stuck to his face, and he climbed out of the crate and urinated in a corner. There wasn't much. He hadn't had food or drink since his midnight snack, and his stomach growled and squeaked. As he exited the basement into the house, dawn leaked over the horizon, and Ash's third morning in the valley dawned bright and clear. The last of the storm had blown through, and though the air was brisk, the sun beat down on the valley and burned off the morning frost, mist lifting through the trees like smoke. He went to his room and cleaned up, but saw no one. He ate breakfast alone, sipping his coffee in the stillness on the portico. The selection of food was poor: dry toast, thin butter, and cold scrambled eggs. No juice or drinks, only water. Rogers didn't appear. As the group of hunters diminished, so did Tremont's hospitality. As far as Ash knew, he, Candace, and Sean were the only ones left, and he'd alienated them by siding with Otto. He was on his own. He chuckled to himself. Hadn't he been for a long time? On his way out of the tunnels the prior night, Ash had been afraid to go back into the mine and retrieve DePauli's bullet and spider figurine. He considered going back down into the basement to retrieve them, but decided against it. He had 2 bullets, and assuming the shot he'd heard the prior day had been Sean's, he and Candace only had 2 bullets left. He also had 2 statues, the Bigfoot and the bear. 3 more and he'd ensure victory. He stashed the figurines in the woods, but the bullets were in a back pocket, his folded karambit in the other. He was walking down the main path heading for the lake, the sun beating on his neck, when a gunshot echoed off the cliff walls. Ash darted from the path and slipped behind a tree, searching for the source of the noise. Ahead, the lake glistened in the early morning sun, shards of light cutting across the path and the woods beyond. Nothing moved at the edge of the forest, and everything beneath the tree canopy was still and full of shadows. He slipped from cover but didn't use the path. He stayed in the shadow of the tree line, working his way toward the lake where he expected to find a pedestal with a missing Loch Ness Monster statue. The echo of the gunshot had died away, and the forest symphony again rang through the valley. The woods gave way to the lake's edge, and Ash was forced to leave his cover, but all was quiet. As expected, at the end of the dock, a pillar with Nessie carved into it stood empty. Ash sighed. He assumed Sean or Candace had claimed Loch Ness. A win-win. Now Sean had a knife, his statue, and Candace had her dragon. That left the snake, the Jersey Devil, the bunyip, and the mecha creature to be found. If the spider was still with DePauli's corpse, that left the melee wide open. Another gunshot rang out, and Ash's head jerked toward the woods to the west. Dense forest packed the edge of the shoreline, the thick canopy creating a mix of dancing shadows, the chill breeze pushing around leaves and underbrush. The mournful cry of an animal in pain echoed off the stone walls. The dangers that lurked beneath the forest canopy didn't concern Ash in that moment. An anger built in him. Desperation. Part of him wanted to seek out the shots, see what was happening, perhaps help. Another part of him wanted to sneak back to the house and get to Polly's figurine. Stay away from whatever trouble was brewing in the forest. Ash fingered the 2 bullets in his back pocket. If the gunshots he'd heard were Sean, the Scot was out of ammo. He darted toward the unbroken fringe of woods that ran along the shore. He saw broken tree branches, trampled undergrowth, and a rough trail zigzagged through the forest as if made by a drunken cow, or something bigger. Ash hadn't gone far when he reached the first signs of confrontation. A wounded beast had thrashed around in the underbrush. The forest's tangled mess of weeds were flattened, a nearby tree trunk was scarred, and tree branches were broken. A puddle of dark blood seeped into the ground, the stink of death thick in the air. A small glittering object caught Ash's attention, and he knelt and picked it up. It was an empty cartridge, a .22 caliber. Ash examined the ground closely and found the footprints of two people. One was clearly Sean's boot, the other, the smaller print, most likely Candace's. The trail of prints, blood, and beaten vegetation ran deeper into the forest, and Ash followed. Sean must have wounded something with his first shot, but didn't take it down. Maybe he had with the second and final shot. He shook his head. He was making so many assumptions his reasoning meant nothing. He had no idea who he was chasing, or who fired the shot the prior day. For all he knew, Sean could still have all three of his bullets. There were those that could tell the type of gun being fired by the sound of the shot, but Ash wasn't one of those people. He picked up his pace, ducking under tree branches and traversing thickets of pricker bushes. Stray rays of sunlight pierced the tree canopy and fell on the forest floor like spotlights. Birds sang. Leaves rattled. Ash froze, sniffing. The faint scent of cigarette smoke wafted through the woods and jarred a memory. What was it? Ash struggled to remember where and when he'd last smelled the scent, but he came up blank. There were voices ahead, and as Ash passed east of the dragon paddock, he saw Candace and Sean standing over a dead bunyip. He eased behind a thick bush, peering through the thick foliage. A giant, seal-like beast was covered in blood, and two bullet holes marred its torso. Large, glassy black eyes stared up at the clear blue sky, sunlight glittering off the beast's 3-inch claws. Sean and Candace were talking, but Ash couldn't make out what they were saying. Pain ran down Ash's spine, and he shifted his weight. A dead branch snapped beneath his feet, and Sean and Candace's head jerked in his direction. Rogers glided through the forest, the sound of his maneuvering jets muffled by the insect chorus and the wind. The bot positioned itself behind a large oak tree, watching. "Show yourself, or I'm gonna start firing," Sean yelled. Metal scraped on metal as he slammed the rifle's bolt home. Ash knew the man was bluffing because he had no bullets. So Ash thought, but why reveal himself? But why not? Would Sean shoot him for no reason? No. The train might have derailed, but Sean was no killer. Ash stood and strode from the forest as if he hadn't been hiding. "Just me," Ash said as he approached. "Whoa," he said, faking surprise when he saw the bunyip. Sean eyed him but said nothing. Candace came forward and hugged him.
"Happy to see you made it through the night."
"Yeah, you too." Sean harumphed.
"See anyone else?"
Candace asked. DePolly and Otto." "What to say?" Sean and Candace watched him expectantly. "They're gone," Ash said. Candace's hand went to her mouth. "How?" Sean said. The suspicion in his voice was palpable. Was there any reason not to tell them? Ash's mind raced. He still couldn't get himself out of the competition mode into survival mode. What mode were Sean and Candace in? He decided there was no harm in spilling the info. In fact, it might start the process of regaining Sean's trust. "Otto was taken out by that creature, the Jersey Devil. I saw it with my own eyes," he said. When he didn't continue, Candace said,
"And DePolly?"
"I followed her into the basement last night. Tracked her into the mine," Ash said.
"What was she doing down there?"
Candace said. Ash hiked his shoulders. "That's what I was trying to find out." "She could have been searching for statues," Sean said. Ash nodded.
"What happened to her?"
Candace asked. "The Yeti." Sean and Candace said nothing. "You get the Loch Ness sculpture?" Ash said. Sean looked at Candace, and she nodded.
"The bunyip also. And before you ask, the thing chased us. Sean did what he had to do,"
Candace said. Ash nodded. So they were still playing the game, at least on some level. He said, "Those 3 shots I heard, that all you?" Sean nodded.
Ash considered giving Sean his bullets as a peace offering, or maybe try and work out some type of share deal.
Well, hello!
A deep male voice rumbled over the clearing. The scent of cigarette smoke filled Ash's nostrils as he searched in vain to find the source of the voice. Sean waved the empty gun around, and Candace cowered behind him, her head peeking over his shoulder.
So, then there were 3, the voice said.
A gunshot rang out, and a puff of dirt rose from the ground before Candace. Ash dropped into a crouch, as did Sean and Candace. A manic laugh echoed through the valley.
No worries. I'm not going to hurt you. Yet.
Ash sprang for the cover of the forest, and another shot pierced the day. He froze, a puff of dirt sprouting ahead of him.
Now, no running away. That isn't nice.
A long shadow fell over the clearing, and a man strode from the woods, a cloud of white smoke obscuring his head. Bells rang in Ash's head. The smell of cigarette smoke. It all made sense. Treemont had been with them the entire way, hiding in the valley, watching and waiting. But why had he chosen this moment to reveal himself? A gust of wind tore away the cigarette smoke, revealing the helicopter pilot that had brought the party to the valley. The dour man with a waxy complexion and salt and pepper hair that Ash remembered no longer looked meek and frail. His jeans and blue dress shirt with silver epaulettes on the collar was gone, as was the blue cap, replaced by jungle camouflage fatigues. He wore a Glock on his hip, and an M4 carbine was pinned to his shoulder and aimed at Sean's head. He came on confidently, never taking his eyes off Sean. Treemont said,
I know there's no bullets in that thing, but put it down anyway.
When Sean didn't comply, Rogers glided from the forest and took it from him. Sean didn't protest, and the bot silently backed off with the gun pointed at the sky.
Now, with that nastiness handled, we can finish this, yes?
Ash, Sean, and Candace said nothing.
Oh, come on. Tell me you're not having fun. You're alive, aren't you? That's more than the rest of the competitors can say.
Sean lost his patience and lunged forward, and for an instant, Ash thought he was attacking. Treemont held the M4 steady, and Sean skidded to a halt 5 feet from the man.
What do you want from us? If you want us dead, why not just shoot us? Why all the bullshit?
Sean screamed.
Want you dead? Treemont said. No, I don't want all of you dead. Just 8 of you.
You're fucking crazy if you think I'm still playing your game, Ash said.
Do you have a choice? Treemont said.
Ash, Sean, and Candace said nothing.
Oh, come now. You're not so innocent. None of you are. And it's time to pay the piper, as they say.
Sean balled his fists, his entire head turning bright red, his freckles sticking out like black bugs.
And who made you judge?
Ash yelled. In his anger, Treemont jerked the gun barrel in Ash's direction, and Sean sprang. The Scot flew through the air, hands out like eagle talons. Treemont was faster. He swung the M4 and fired. The gun rattled, 15 rounds, spitting from the barrel in 2 seconds, empty cartridges bouncing off Tremont's black boots. Red bullet holes stitched across Sean's chest, but the big man's momentum brought him on, and he barreled into Treemont and took him to the ground. Candace screamed and fled into the forest, and Treemont didn't even glance in her direction. Treemont thrashed and rolled, trying to get away from Sean, but the Scot wasn't dead yet. Blood poured from his mouth and dripped onto Tremont's face as Sean locked his hands on the man's neck. The 2 men struggled, blood pouring from Sean, his rage and adrenaline giving him one last burst of strength. Treemont sputtered and coughed as he pulled and tore at Sean's arms, trying to free himself, but Sean held him fast. Sean's head as red as a cherry. Tremont's legs spasmed as his face turned purple and life left him. Sean choked and splattered blood across Tremont's dead face. With the adrenaline fleeing, the rage drained and fear crept over Sean's face. He looked around, smiled,
then fell face forward onto Tremont's corpse and didn't move again. Rogers beeped inside and floated into the trees. Ash fell to his knees, fear, joy, and anguish fighting for control of his emotions. Treemont was dead. Ash let his head fall into his hands and he rubbed his eyes and twisted his neck. The dust settled, and Candace was nowhere to be seen. His heart slowed, his breathing steadied, and his stomach growled. It was over. Candace and Ash were the only ones left. 27. The trees whispered inside, a chill breeze stirring the forest. Nothing moved in the clearing, and the sun glared down like an accusing eye as the morning wore away. White clouds filled the horizon at the eastern edge of the valley, and tendrils of mist reached for the ground. No birds sang. It was as if the entire valley knew the leader of the Cryptid Club was dead. Sean's bloody corpse lay atop Tremont's, the two men forever tangled. Ash got to his feet. His legs were like jello, and pain ran to his extremities. He lumbered forward in a daze, Sean's dead eyes staring up at him as if asking a question. "Sorry, buddy." Ash knelt, looked over his shoulder, and pushed Sean's corpse off Tremont's. Ash took Sean's rifle, which he had 2 bullets for. To Ash's surprise, he found that Sean had 3 statues. In addition to Loch Ness, he had the bunyip and the spider. Ash's mind reeled, and he fell back onto his ass. How had Sean gotten the spider? He must have gone down into the basement and found DePauli's body. When had he had the time? Had he followed last night? Rogers glided from the forest and came to a stop before Ash, the bot's lens eyes scoping in and out. He squeaked out, "Are you okay, Mr. Cohn?" Ash said nothing. "By my count, you are in possession of 5 figurines, are you not?" Ash said nothing. "May I see them?" Anger surged through Ash. People were dead, and whether they deserved it or not wasn't his job to decide. He wanted to smash Rogers to dust, pound the bot until there was nothing left but a pile of smoking electronics. Instead, Ash complied because in the end he could think of no good reason not to. He laid the 5 small figurines on the ground, the Bigfoot, the bear, Nessie, the bunyip, and DePauli's spider. Rogers glided forward and examined the pieces, then rotated away, and before Ash realized what the machine was doing, it snatched up Tremont's M4 and disappeared back into the trees. Ash sat there, mouth hanging open as he watched the bot go. A horn blast pierced the day, its sharp bleat echoing over the valley. The melee was over. Ash had won. Then another thought wormed its way into his head like a maggot. The game wasn't over. There was no other explanation. If Ash was the last and Treemont was dead, it was up to Rogers to make the final decision. That's what the hologram had said, but the hologram was full of shit. He rubbed his eyes again, pain knifing through his head. If the game wasn't over, who was playing? Candace. How had he forgotten? Ash finished searching Sean and found a most unusual item. The pin from Snake's turban. How had Sean gotten it? Ash left it in his room after the search. A scream floated on the breeze. It came from the north and sounded close. Candace. Ash bolted to his feet and stuffed one of his .22 caliber shells into the rifle and slammed the bolt home. Sweat dripped into his eyes and down his back despite the chill breeze. He plunged into the forest, following Candace's trail. Flattened vegetation led to a thin animal path, and Ash stopped and examined the ground. Bare, human-like footprints marked the hardpan, the thin scratches of 2-inch claws at the end of each of the 4 digits. Small boot prints interspersed with the claw marks, and both sets of prints went east toward the house. Another wail broke the stillness. There was no doubt it was Candace. Ash doubled his pace, surging through the undergrowth, rifle out before him. At 12,000 feet, there weren't many spiders, mosquitoes, and flies, but gnats and small black flies called no-see-ums bit and sucked at Ash's exposed skin as he pushed through the dense vegetation.
Birds squawked and yelled as he passed, breaking tree branches and rattling leaves, leaving no mystery of his direction. His lungs burned. He'd adjusted to the elevation, but 12,000 feet was 12,000 feet, and he didn't think he'd ever get used to it, no matter how long he stayed in the valley. The main path loomed ahead, and Ash slowed. A massive form stood in the forest ahead, its back to Ash. The creature Ash had labeled Bad Bigfoot peered through the vegetation, slowly moving forward through the underbrush, watching something on the main path Ash couldn't see. Ash checked the gun again as he worked his way south, putting space between himself and the massive Sasquatch. The creature's dirty fur was matted with dark blood all around its torso, and dark stains covered the hair around its mouth and claws. Yellow fangs hung over thick lips, and the eyes, even without the creature looking directly at him, Ash felt the weight of those eyes. The terror behind those yellow slits of anger. Candace stood on the main path, facing a dark figure wrapped in green. She held Sean's knife in her hand, and she slashed at the person, feinting back and forth, lunging with the knife. The stranger wore a deep green jumpsuit with a headscarf wrapped around their head and face. The attacker was screaming and shouting at Candace, but Ash couldn't make out what was being said. He brought up the rifle and sighted the stranger's back. The Sasquatch roared, a primal scream of rage that made the stranger look over a shoulder. Ash sucked in a deep breath. The person in green wore a black sack over their head, with a white smiley face drawn on its front. The stranger brought up a handgun and panned it across the forest where the Bigfoot and Ash hid. Leaves tapped and trees creaked in the wind, gnats dive-bombed his head, and the scent of shit leaked through the forest. The Sasquatch disappeared into the underbrush, and Ash took his eye away from the rifle's sight. Candace saw her opportunity and took it. She sprang, slashing with her knife, going for the stranger's smiley face. The person in green wheeled, aimed the gun, and fired. The shot rang out and echoed through the valley. Candace came on, the shot missing her and plunking into a tree to her left. She screamed, diving forward in one last surge, knife out before her in a double-handed grip. The stranger brought up an arm to block the blow, but the knife tore through fabric and flesh as the blade was deflected. The stranger screamed, blood leaking from the wound. The gun barked again, a small puff of dirt rising from the ground next to Candace. The pop of the bullet reminded Ash he had a gun. But before he could get the rifle stock to his shoulder, a Sasquatch burst from the woods. 9 feet tall, natty brown hair hanging in thick strands, the beast slammed into the stranger, and the beast, Candace, and the stranger went to the ground in a tangle. A cloud of dust filled the air, and Ash took several fast steps forward, positioning himself between a thorn bush 10 feet from the thrashing cryptid and mound of people. The scene was comical. He'd spent so much time convincing himself he wasn't crazy, that what he'd seen was real. Now, as he watched a Bigfoot wrestle a Brit and a masked assailant, again he felt like reality might be slipping from his grasp. The gun barked 3 times, and the beast roared. The creature bucked and heaved as Candace tried to separate herself from the fight. To Ash, it looked as though the cryptid had far more interest in the masked attacker than it did with Candace. Ash sighted the Sasquatch's head and eased off the safety. The beast turned, yellow, glowing eyes searching the forest and finding Ash. Confusion spread over the monkey-like face, the beast's mouth falling open a crack, revealing 2 rows of sharp teeth. Candace jerked free of the living knot, vaulted to her feet, and ran for the forest. A gunshot rang out, and Ash jumped. He hadn't fired. The Sasquatch fell to its knees, blood spurting from its leg. The person in green kicked the Sasquatch in the chest and knocked it onto its back. Candace was almost to the woods, not looking back. The stranger spun like a ballerina, arm out, pistol at the ready. A gunshot rang out and Candace spasmed, a red hole appearing on the back of her jacket as she crumpled to the ground. Ash sighted the rifle and fired. The crack of the hammer striking home, the pop of gunpowder expanding, and the whoosh as the bullet left the barrel, filling his head. The shot missed and thumped into the ground, a puff of dirt rising into the air. Ash pulled back the rifle's bolt, dropped his last bullet into the firing chamber, and slammed the bolt home.
The pop of gunfire filled the clearing as the stranger fired in Ash's direction, and leaves were cut from branches, bullets ricocheted off rocks, and wood splinters flew as the shots peppered trees. The stranger dropped into a crouch and Ash fired. He didn't wait to see if he'd hit the masked person and used his shot as a diversion. Ash bolted into the forest, branches slapping his face, gnats invading his nose, mouth, and eyes. He headed away from the house. There were no sounds of pursuit, and when he believed he'd gone far enough, he paused to catch his breath behind a thicket of thorn bushes with small yellow leaves. Ash pulled for air as he gathered his courage, and when his heart had slowed and his nerves had calmed, he followed his own trail back to Candace. He couldn't abandon her. She'd always been kind to him, and Ash had always thought she had a thing for him, but like many things in his life since the incident, he hadn't taken it seriously. When he arrived back at the scene of the attack, Ash found the Sasquatch and the person in green gone, drips of blood leading away into the forest. Candace lay still where she'd fallen, her long blonde hair splayed across her face. A pool of dark blood spread beneath the corpse, her eyes staring into the next world. Ash knelt and looked for a pulse. Candace was gone. Ash cried then, all the emotions of the last 4 days spilling from him in a deluge. He didn't know any of these people, didn't really care if they lived or died. But Candace, Sean, Otto, and the others, they didn't deserve to go out like this, at the whim of a madman or madwoman. Neither did he. Suddenly, Ash felt eyes on him again. That feeling he'd had since he'd stepped off the helicopter. Those fears brought all the questions forward like a crowd of kids trying to get to the ice cream truck's window. Who was the person in green? Was it one of the other 8? Someone else? Clearly the pilot wasn't Treemont, if there'd ever been a Treemont. Ash was starting to doubt even that. Everything they'd been told was a lie, but he figured that out a little too late. Ash took the knife Candace had gotten from Sean and covered her body with stones as the midday sun arced overhead. When he was done, he worked his way up to the house. He was careful, staying in the shadows, keeping under cover. Whoever the person dressed in green was, they'd had no trouble shooting an unarmed woman in the back, and Ash realized, though he was the last, he hadn't won anything. To the contrary, he was being hunted. Ash encountered no living creatures on his way back to the house, and when he reached the bluestone structure, he paused, looking back the way he'd come. The stranger didn't make an appearance, and neither did Rogers. Ash thought he'd heard the bot's maneuvering thrusters several times as he snuck through the woods, but he'd been unable to catch a glimpse of the tin can. The back door was unlocked, and Ash entered the long hallway, memories of his first night in the valley rushing back. Dark blood still stained the wood floor and splattered the walls. Snake had been the first to go, or had he? Ash searched his memory, looking for any clue that might tell him who the stranger was. Frustration sent a tingle of angst down his spine and his stomach grumbled, so he made his way up to the dining room. He found a stale loaf of bread and a hard chunk of white cheese with green fungus gnawing its fringe. Thankfully, nobody had messed with the wine supply, and Ash opened a bottle of red and wandered out onto the portico with some bread. He pulled a seat over and leaned it against the side of the house, protecting his back. He sat, his view of the northern and eastern sections of the valley unobstructed. Ash drank from the bottle. He felt drained, numb, and he didn't know what to do. Sit around and wait for the mystery stranger to pick him off like a duck at a carnival? He didn't think that was the plan, however. Everything so far had been orchestrated, and Ash had to believe the mastermind of this shit show had come up with a better ending than picking him off at long range with a gun. But perhaps things hadn't gone according to plan. Ash sat on the porch for a long time, staring at the forest, the empty rifle resting on his lap. When the bottle of wine was gone, dusk had seeped through the forest, the eastern end of the valley filled with a pink and purple cotton candy sky. He thought of Ophelia, all his mistakes, all the bad decisions that had led him to this end. He should have blinked and walked out of the damn forest and buried what he'd seen deep and gone on with his life. Then he never would have become a hunter, never would have met Candace or Sean or any of them. The sun set.
darkness spreading over the valley like a blanket. Stars blinked above, the line of dark clouds in the east growing as they approached. He leaned back and his eyes slipped closed and he jerked them open. This was no place to fall asleep. A beast cackled in the forest, and the call was answered by a screech and a roar. All the creatures of the valley were trapped here, just like him. They'd been captured, tricked, and manipulated. Ash recalled the last verse of the Atavism Special Animal Sanctuary poem. Callous to pain as the rose, breathe with instinct's delight, live the existence that goes, soulless, into the night. He didn't know how it had been done to him, or who had done it, but Ash sure felt soulless and alone. 28. For the second night in a row, Ash slept like a squirrel. With the killer on the loose, he loathed the thought of going up to his room, so he went back into the basement and found his crate. Sleep never fully came. It teased and cajoled as it often does. Ash gave up, climbed out of his coffin-like bed, and headed upstairs. Stars still blinked in the darkness, the thick clouds tearing apart as they reached the Andes. It had gotten much colder, and Ash shivered. The old blue granite house was silent, and when he arrived in the dining room, he found Rogers waiting for him. "You did not go to your room this evening," the bot stated. Ash said nothing as he examined the same bread and cheese that had been laid out the prior night. "Have you slept? You'll need to be rested to face the coming day." Anger swelled in Ash, the matter-of-fact way the bot talked to him, like he had no choice except to play the game. The garbage pail had been MIA for the last 12 hours. Ash surged toward Rogers, intent on pounding the bot to scrap, but he pulled up short. "What the hell do you know about it? All you do is skulk around. Where the hell were you when Sean needed help? Candace, who the hell is pulling your strings?" The bot chirped, its eyes zoomed in and out, but Rogers said nothing. Ash spun on the ball of his right foot and swung his left leg in a wide arc, his foot connecting with the bot's pseudo-head. Rogers was knocked back a few feet, regained its balance, and jetted forward until it hovered where it had been, eyes scoping. "Do you feel better now, sir?" "Why the hell are you here?" Ash looked at the pitiful food. "You said you'd take care of us. What is this shit?" He pointed at the hard bread and green cheese. "Things are coming to an end, Mr. Cohn. How do you not see?" "Then why shouldn't I smash you to pieces just for fun?" Ash knew it was a stupid thing to say. The bot seemed to know also. It squeaked, then pushed air through its grill-like mouth. "Did you just sigh at me?" "Sir, I do have a purpose here, but first I think I can put your mind at ease," Rogers said. "The illusion of control is a dangerous thing, Mr. Cohn. The more of it you think you have, the less you actually have. Do you understand?" Ash was coming to detest the bot's squeaky mechanical voice. "You're saying I have no choice?" "Precisely. If you were to destroy me, I would be replaced." Ash said nothing. "What is the human saying?" Rogers chirped and beeped. "The devil you know?" "You said you had a purpose. Care to share it?" Rogers spun and glided from the room. Ash downed a glass of water, grabbed a couple of slices of stale bread, and followed. He caught up with the bot as it exited the back door. "Care to tell me where we're going?" "Haven't you wondered what the monument light falls on? What it marks, and when?" Rogers said. Ash rubbed his chin as he fell in alongside the bot, but he said nothing. At first, Ash didn't know what Rogers was talking about. Monument light? Then he recalled how the moonlight shined through the hole at the top of the sculpture and marked a spot in the valley. Stars blinked down at them as they skirted the edge of the house and followed the path to the monument. They passed the red stain that had been Otto. The Jersey Devil was long gone, and Rogers powered north into the forest, heading for a thin path that would take them toward the bear and snake paddocks. A chunk of moon was visible at the very southern edge of the valley, rays of fading moonlight arcing into the valley. "Is that where we're going? Where the light marks?" This all made no sense. Ash was no astronomer, but he knew the phases of the moon changed continuously,
and thus the spotlight created by the monument would shift and move as each day passed into the next. Yes, Ash harumphed. That's it? Why now? It's time for you to see what the valley lacks. Lacks? The odd pair cut deeper into the forest, the thick tree canopy stifling most of the starlight and moonlight. You will see. Ash's frustration boiled over. Perspiration bloomed on his forehead, stomach burning, a chill, clammy tremor running through him. Why do you have to show me? Isn't that what all this crap is about? The game? The challenge? Why not let me figure it out on my own? The bot chirped, beeped, and went silent for a time, its maneuvering jets hissing in the stillness. After several minutes, Rogers said, As you've seen, the cone of light created by the monument is quite large. Therefore, there are several days throughout the year where the Dreamer Garden's location is marked with the light. Now is not such a time, however, and Mr. Treemont wanted you to see this, hoped you'd find it on your own, actually. The valley isn't large, and it's just another of the sanctuary's attractions. Ash didn't like that the bot was making the valley sound like Disneyland, and as he trudged through the forest, dawn still 2 hours off, he wondered if he wasn't being led into a trap, or at least some type of confrontation. But like many things he'd encountered in the valley, did it matter? As Rogers had pointed out, he had no real control, so he might as well go with the flow. But Ash didn't roll like that. He stopped walking, and Rogers disappeared into the darkness. He stood still, turning his hearing, eliminating the push of the wind, the whine of the night symphony, and the occasional whelp, gurgle, or bark that echoed through the woods. He didn't hear Rogers' thrusters, and the steady strum of the valley he'd gotten used to had gone still. Ash had to get the tunnel door open. The seed of an idea sprouted, and Ash mentally counted the dead batteries he'd used in the flashlight. Ash had hidden the useless light and spent fuel cells the prior day, never knew what they could be used for, and as a plan formed in his head, Ash smiled. That was for later, however. He waited. 10 minutes turned into 20. 30. Shit, Ash screamed when Rogers didn't return. He could head back to the house, but what purpose would that serve? Nope, he needed to walk willingly into the net, see what his host wanted him so desperately to see. Ash followed Rogers and found the bot waiting 100 yards down the path. Without a sound, Rogers glided through the woods. A hissing ran through the forest, but it wasn't near. Ash and Rogers slipped behind a large boulder as dawn filled the eastern end of the valley, gray light leaking through the forest. The hissing died away, and the duo continued on until they reached an overgrown garden with an odd assortment of sculptures made from a variety of materials at its edges. Please excuse the weeds and lack of trimming. Ms. S. The valley's caretaker doesn't care much for tradition. Who is Ms. S? Rogers said nothing. Fine. What tradition? Ash knew that was the exact question the bot wanted him to ask, but he wanted to get on with whatever show was planned. Now that he had an idea how he might escape the valley, that's all his food and sleep-deprived mind could think about. Look closer, Rogers said. The closest sculpture was a kraken. Its giant bulbous head made of stone, its many twisting legs metal rebar, its eyes emerald stones. To its right, a rendering of a man with wings. At first, Ash thought it was a Jersey devil, but there was no menace in the creature's expression, no fangs or claws. Chiseled into the white and black speckled granite statue at its base was the word Mothman. Ash rolled his shoulders and cracked his neck, an odd sense of unease spreading through him. He looked at Rogers, who hadn't moved. The bot hovered, camera lens eyes focused on Ash. A large bird wheeled overhead, and a long bellow came from the direction of the lake. Ash wandered through the overgrown cemetery-like park. There was a gray statue of an alien with a large round head labeled Gray, a giant ape, and a huge bird with wide-spreading wings unfurled labeled Phoenix, and several other odd creatures with names Ash had never heard of and couldn't even pronounce. These creatures? These are the beasts nobody has been able to capture? Ash said. When the sanctuary began, Sir Huevelmans wanted those who visited to never be complacent, to never get lost in all the mystical things here in the valley. The Dreamer Garden was meant to inspire, remind every hunter who came here that there were still many mysteries to uncover. Why bring me here? Why would you think I'd care? This little game of bullshit is getting old. I need a gunshot pierced the day and a bullet plunked into the torso of a beast made of wood and stone.
You still don't understand, do you?
The voice was clearly disguised, the brash haughtiness unachievable without effort. What do you want from me? You want the valley? It's yours. What the hell is this all about? Ash yelled. Another shot rang out and Ash ran. He'd had enough. He'd retrieve his batteries and get to work on his escape. He was done. The faint sound of hissing grew as he ran on, and he thought he saw Tallboy watching him from behind a tree, but when he looked closer, the Sasquatch was gone, or it had never been there. Ash was starting to see threats around every bend and in every shadow. Shrill laughter followed him through the jungle, the sound of snapping branches and footfalls marking his pursuit. Ash darted past the snake paddock, his mind running backward, remembering the creature had escaped. The hissing got louder and the sound of the pursuit grew. "Where are you running to, Mr. Cohn?" Roger's speaker-enhanced voice rang through the woods. Ash burst from the trees into a clearing. The massive snake lifted its head and turned its obsidian eyes on Ash, its tongue lashing through 2-foot fangs. The beast's body undulated and expanded as it uncoiled, the hissing getting so loud it blocked out all other sound except the galloping of Ash's heart. He stood frozen, the snake blocking his way and Rogers and the stranger stopping his retreat. The massive snake moved with amazing speed for a creature of its size, and it was halfway to Ash when his brain issued orders and the fight-or-flight decision was made. He bolted into the forest, a thick tree branch grazing the side of his head as the snake lunged, its jaws snapping on air. The beast cried in frustration, a mix of an angry scream and a cry of pain. "You can't hide any more, Mr. Cohn." It was Rogers. Logic be damned, if he got the opportunity again, he'd take pleasure in smashing the life from the bot. Ash didn't care about its replacement. Snapping branches and the sounds of vegetation being crushed filled the woods as the snake pursued Ash. He couldn't outrun it, couldn't fight it, so his only hope was to find a place to hide. Could snakes climb trees? Even in his frantic state, he knew they did, so that old staple of security wasn't an option. Plus, the thing could lift its head 20 feet off the ground. He zigzagged through the forest, cutting as close to trees as possible, slipping through thickets of pricker bushes and between stacked lines of trees. None of these measures slowed the beast, and when Ash glanced over his shoulder, the snake's flat, angular head was only feet behind him. The creature's huge head lowered to the ground, its body twisting and surging through the underbrush, a forked tongue the size of a fire hose shooting through fangs that dripped with the saliva of anticipation. Ash threw himself into a cluster of bushes to his right, branches spearing him like knives, leaves raking his face. A loud crunch reverberated through the forest and gunshots tore through the woods, plunking into the ground, tree trunks, and underbrush. The hissing ceased. Ash jumped, grabbed a branch, and swung in a wide arc, changing his direction yet again. He stopped running when he saw the snake wasn't moving, blood leaking from a hole between its eyes. Why kill the beast? It was after Ash, almost had him. A sick feeling settled in Ash's stomach, a warning that told him something wasn't right and that things were about to go sideways. As if reading his mind, the false voice of the stranger echoed through the valley.
"I want to kill you myself."
The malevolence in the voice surprised Ash. What had he done to make this person hate him so? He recalled something Sean had said about injuries undeserved, but there was no accounting for insanity, and whoever had trapped him here was surely insane. With the snake dead, Ash felt exposed and he looked around for cover, but anger and defiance fought with the rational side of his brain, the side that said survival was the goal. But the human race had been hurting itself since the first bipedal creature inched from the sea, and Ash was no different. He sat on a stone, indignant. I won't play your game any longer. I'm done, so go fu— A gunshot rang out. Pain pierced Ash's right leg and he rolled off the stone onto the hard pan, covering his head. You will, or I'll put a bullet in your head. Piss off, asshole, was the best Ash could come up with. The manic laughter returned, but it wasn't close. Ash lay prone and examined the gunshot wound. It was only a graze, and the bullet had buried itself in the ground. The gash was deep, however, and a thick stream of blood ran from the wound. The scratches on his chest screamed as Ash squeezed the cut, forcing more blood out, trying to clean the new wound as best he could without water or alcohol. He pulled the knife he'd taken off Candace's corpse and cut a patch of fabric from his shirt tail. He made a bandage and cut 2 thin strips to hold it in place. Blood turned the bandage red in seconds, but it was stopping most of the blood flow and helping the wound close. He peered over the edge of the stone he hid behind, scanning the forest, but he didn't see Rogers or the stranger. Ash got to his feet, testing his leg, applying more weight until he stood steady. The gash ached, but he could walk, even run if he had to. He'd been lucky, but he had the ominous feeling his luck had run out. 29. The new day brought the rain. Thin sheets of drizzle that soaked Ash through as he trekked through the forest. He was chilled to the bone, and his leg ached, but the bleeding had stopped. His stomach screamed, his mouth dry as paper, but he didn't feel that bad considering what he'd been through. The creatures of the night had gone silent, and the beasts of the day had yet to pick up the cadence, and the early morning stillness made Ash uneasy. He was normally comfortable in the woods, but he doubted he'd ever be able to take a stroll through nature again. Silence covered the forest like a blanket, and a dingy gray light spilled through the dense tree canopy. The cry of a startled bird floated through the woods, and Ash froze, slipping behind a tree trunk. Something was working its way through the underbrush behind him, pacing itself, going slow, trying to be silent as it followed his path of crushed vegetation. But in the early morning quiet, the sounds rang through the forest like an alarm. Panic knifed through Ash. He should have been more careful, paid more attention, and left no signs. But even as those thoughts flitted through his head, he knew it wouldn't have mattered. Treemont, or whoever the hell he or she was, had been watching everything since the beginning, and he had no reason to believe that wasn't the case now. He glanced around at the trees and weeds, expecting to see Rogers watching from the shadows. Suddenly, a sense of urgency gripped him, and he snapped from his reverie. There was a thick evergreen to his right, its long branches drooping under the weight of its many small green leaves. He could hide under the tree's boughs, but if the stranger had dogs, or could track him, or Tallboy was along, he had to run. A branch snapped very close, and Ash slipped around the evergreen, but he saw the glint of Roger's metal body picking through the woods. Nowhere to run. Ash mounted a thin oak. He shimmied up the foot-round trunk, using branches as steps, his feet slipping, leaves falling. He realized how much noise he was making and decided to hide. He lay prone on a thick branch, arms wrapped around the limb. There was a branch directly below him, packed with leaves the size of a hand, and he could barely see the ground directly below him. Maybe it would be enough. He inched further out onto the branch so his legs wouldn't be seen if someone stood next to the tree's trunk and looked directly up. The limb bent and twisted, and Ash froze. He peered through a tangle of branches and green leaves and watched the stranger thread through the forest, Mira trailing after. Ash hadn't seen Mira since the challenge behind the house in the snow, but he figured she'd seen him. The odd creature was half machine, half flesh, and its 6 steel, multi-jointed legs picked through the underbrush. The path his pursuers followed was leading the stranger right to his tree. He looked for nearby branches. Maybe he could move through the treetops. Me not Tarzan, he thought, and the tree he was in swayed slightly from his weight and couldn't take his movement. If he started moving around, they'd see him for sure. He took a deep breath, the forest chorus picking up speed and strength, as if the creatures of the wood were trying to help him. The stranger still wore the black sack with a smiley face. Rogers joined the group, looking as he always did, but Ash couldn't stop staring at the mecha beast. Its torso of metal, circuits, wires, blood vessels, and flesh was bloodied and torn, and the creature shuffled forward in a spider-like sideways gait, legs churning. Blood vessels and muscle encased in wires and intertwined with circuits and metal supports gave way to a short torso, from which hung 4 arms, 3 long talons protruding from the ends of each. The beast's pumpkin-like white head turned side to side, its 4 dark, glassy, softball-sized eyes scanning the underbrush. Ash gasped and put his hand over his mouth like a southern belle. Skewered on one of Mira's talons was Emeka Sasai's head. The stranger put up a hand and the trio paused, the masked pursuer lifting his head as if sniffing the air. Tears leaked from Ash as he watched his pursuers continue along the path. Emeka's head was crushed, the mecha's leg piercing the top of her skull. Dark lines of dried blood ran down her forehead, and her eyes had been gouged out. The creature didn't seem to know the head was there. He hadn't known her well, but Ash felt his insides melt, his skin trying to crawl off his body. He'd seen enough death in the last 4 days to last a lifetime, and sorrow washed over him. The faint sound of metal tinkling on metal froze Ash to his tree limb, arms tightening, chest scratches wailing, leg wound burning. The trio was close now. So close, Ash saw the dark eyes of the stranger through the holes in the sack. He knew those eyes. And as the party got closer, a knot so tight and so dense gripped his chest that for a moment he couldn't breathe. The stranger paused 10 feet from the tree and bent, examining the ground next to the evergreen where Ash had stood. The stranger sniffed, and the person looked up, dark eyes searching the evergreen canopy. If the stranger had been alone, perhaps Ash might have pulled his karambit and dove from the tree, making a desperate attack. But with Mira and Rogers there, and the M4 in the stranger's hand, Ash's options were nil. He hated that feeling. It was worse than fear or loss, that rumble in your stomach and tightness in your chest that told you there was no control. It was all an illusion. The hunter stood, stretching as if sore, then put hands on hips and the tingle of metal on metal again rang through the forest. Rogers circled the area, and Mira stood still behind the stranger in green, dark eyes scanning the ground. The stranger pulled off the hood, revealing the beautiful light brown face of Dipali. Ash couldn't breathe. When he first heard her bracelets, he'd known on some level, but he hadn't accepted it. How had this happened? He'd spent so much time with the woman. Had the fight in the mines been fake? Was the Yeti fake? His mind spun, and a thick drop of sweat slipped off his forehead and fell to the ground. Rain leaked through the canopy, so when the drip of sweat landed on a dead leaf with a splat, only Mira's eyes shifted in the direction of the sound. Dipali's dark brown eyes scanned the tree canopy, as if somehow she knew Ash hid within. His path had led the insane woman right to him, but the crushed vegetation also hid the evidence of his climb. Her eyes found Ash's tree and followed the tree's trunk as it rose into the dense canopy. Ash went rigid, back spasming, his leg and wounds thumping in rhythm with his galloping heart. She would see him, there was no doubt. He closed his eyes and gathered his courage to jump. If he could land on Dipali and get away before... Then Ash remembered the empty rifle slung over his back. Dipali's eyes stopped scanning the tree when the branches thickened. Ash eased the rifle ever so carefully from his shoulder, but before he could toss it as a diversion, something caught his eye. Tallboy stood within a thicket of brambles watching the scene unfold. Feeling Ash's stare, the beast looked up at him, dark monkey-like face twisted with worry, eyes shining through the tapestry of branches, its fangs buried under thick gums. Dipali smiled and looked over her shoulder, and Tallboy disappeared into the thick underbrush. Ash threw the rifle and immediately regretted it. Lying flat, balancing on the branch, he had little leverage, and the rifle only went a couple of feet before it started its fall to the ground, bouncing off branches on its way down. It landed with a crash several feet from the base of the tree, and Dipali looked up, her smile gone. She shook her head.
I thought you'd provide more sport than this. Have you no pride?
The woman's voice was no longer honey, but vinegar. Ash didn't speak. She knew he was in the tree somewhere, and she could open fire with the M4 at any moment, and there was nothing he could do. Rogers collected the rifle and brought it to DePauli. Mira didn't move. DePauli accepted the gun, turned from the tree, and started back the way she'd come. Mira fell in behind her, the sound of servos whining and the tap of the mecha beast's metal claws tapping rocks as it retreated. Rogers stood at the base of the tree, still, its lens eyes focused up into the tree canopy. When DePauli and Mira disappeared into the trees, Ash let out a deep breath. He felt like he hadn't breathed in an hour, and his chest ached with stress and fear. What the hell was going on? DePauli had followed his trail, knew he was here, but didn't finish him off. How could she be alive? He'd seen her die. Or had he? The memory of DePauli falling into the blackness stung him like a wasp, and he'd avoided her corpse because of the Yeti. Those thoughts sent pain coursing through him. Why hadn't DePauli ended it? Ash knew the woman was insane, that was pre-established, and insanity had no bounds. The drizzle ended, but everything still dripped with moisture, a cold wind pushing through the valley and chilling Ash. Terror washed over him. She had the M4. Mira. He needed to get through that door. Rogers still stood beneath the tree as if waiting, and Ash gathered his courage. He could take the bot, it didn't have any weapons. Ash climbed to the ground and stood before Rogers, holding his knife before him as if it could do anything against metal. "I suggest you move along, Mr. Cohn. This short respite is almost at an end," Rogers said. Ash plunged into the forest and left Rogers behind. He didn't know where to go, so he changed his direction every few minutes, trying to shake off pursuit, though he knew that wasn't possible. He'd have to face DePauli at some point. The valley wasn't that large. He needed a few things to make his plan work, and he thought he'd be able to find what he needed up at the house, but DePauli would definitely be watching the house. He remembered the mine exit into the valley. He could sneak into the house that way, but that would mean traversing the Yeti. But did it? Clearly what he'd seen the night DePauli died was a trick, and the thought of going down into the dark with only his karambit didn't fill him with hope. No, he'd wait until he was ready to deal with the door. Ash inched through the woods, hiding as he went. He thought of traps he might set, but every idea he had required time, tools, and effort. He had no time or tools, and if he didn't get some food soon, he was going to collapse. The dark clouds were breaking up as they pushed over the Andes, and rays of golden sunlight leaked through the gloom. The air smelled of moisture, earth, and flowers. His tension eased, but then Emika's crushed head filled his mind. The way the dead eyes had watched him with blame. The memory hit him like a shot of anisette. He'd met Emika before arriving in the valley, the memory so clear he couldn't figure out why he hadn't remembered before. He'd been doing research at the small Bigfoot library in Stony Creek, and she'd entered like she owned the place. The library, which was no more than a room behind the closed post office, had binders of newspaper articles relating to Stony Creek's history with Bigfoot. There were some texts, interviews, but it was nothing compared to the sanctuary's collection. She'd looked much different then. Jet black hair, pink nails, and all black clothes. Well, that much at least hadn't changed. He picked his way through a dense patch of brambles and paused, staring back over his shoulder, searching the forest for pursuit. There was nothing there except trees and weeds. Emika had given her name, asked him a few questions, then stormed out without a thank you. He hadn't seen her again until he arrived at the helicopter, and now she was dead. He felt responsible. That was the bane of his life. But he knew none of this was his fault. If he hadn't come, DePauli or Treemont, who the hell ever, would have replaced him, and everyone who was dead would still be dead. Thoughts of home brought memories of Sean and Candace, and Ash felt Candace's wet lips on his cheek. The kiss from the prior day, the memory he'd chosen to cling to. Her bloodied body, long blonde hair covering her dead eyes, was an image he knew he'd fight to chase from his memories for the rest of his days. He hugged himself as he exited the forest onto the main path. Nothing moved, and there was no sign of Rogers, Mira, or DePauli.
Ash, where are you going?"
DePauli stood on the portico above, training a rifle at his head. Ash dropped and rolled. The gun barked, a puff of dust lifting from the ground next to Ash. He kept rolling, like a child going down the side of a sledding hill, arms at his sides, legs tight together. DePauli fired again, but the shot didn't come close and plunked into a tree to his left. Ash slowed his roll. Gunfire erupted, but all the shots were pelting the ground to his left. She wanted him to go right, so he complied. He pressed to his feet and cut between two tall conifers and skidded to a stop. A 9-foot Sasquatch, blood dripping down his leg from a wound, blocked his way. Bad Bigfoot's fur was matted with dark blood, and red and black specks of flesh clung to the creature's fangs and bared teeth. Yellow eyes glowed in the dim light beneath the tree cover. The beast grunted, flexing its claws as it came forward. Ash pulled his karambit and opened it with a flick of his wrist. He spun the blade on his finger, making a show of it, trying to scare the creature. The black knife's fiberglass blade whizzed through the air, and the beast slowed but didn't stop. With a roar of fury, the creature attacked. Ash braced himself, rolling his shoulders as he brought up his fists, curved blade out. 30. The Sasquatch roared as it swiped at Ash, its sharp claws coming up just short of his face. Ash feinted left, punching with his right hand, the karambit's blade slicing across the beast's hairy chest. The blade slashed hair, thick dreadlock-like strands falling to the ground but didn't break the skin. The beast looked down at his missing hair and growled, and when it looked up, its eyes radiated hate. The creature lashed out again, claws out. Ash's leg stung as he pivoted, but he managed to avoid the strike. He kicked as he spun, connecting with the back of the beast's legs. The blow didn't even pause the creature. It did, however, piss it off. A low groan that rose to a bark, then a roar, escaped the beast like a rising thunderclap. Ash backed away, never taking his eyes off the Sasquatch, cycling the karambit back and forth as he flipped it on his index finger. An urgent communication reached Ash from his brain, and he turned and ran, arms out before him as underbrush slashed and tore at his face. The Bigfoot gave chase. Ash heard its harsh breathing and the sound of breaking branches. DePauli's maniacal laughter floated through the forest, an ill sound that sent a chill through Ash. He'd been attracted to her, but hadn't seen through the veil she was wearing. It takes a truly deranged individual to lie and deceive with such credibility and ease. She'd fooled him, and that wound was deeper and hurt more than the others. Old Ash would have never been taken in. Ash the scientist would have immediately questioned the woman's story, her motives. But old Ash was gone, and if he didn't get past that, his life was over whether he survived the valley or not. He doubled his pace, anger burning through him, memories of Ophelia driving him on. He couldn't let her win, let them all win. He wasn't crazy, and if the last 4 days had taught him anything, it was he wasn't nuts, but many of the truths he'd held dear had been shattered. There were magical things, things that shouldn't exist, and he'd seen them. The idea of bringing Ophelia to the valley stirred the pleasure zone of his brain, but that pesky reality-craving bastard always reminded Ash that there was no way Ophelia would come here no matter what he said or did. And that was okay. Time to move on, build a new life. He reached the edge of the forest and paused. He couldn't see the veranda, so he dashed for the back door. The tent pavilion was gone, and nothing moved on the thin strip of turf that separated the forest's edge from the house. He paused at the back door, looking over his shoulder. The 10-foot Sasquatch watched him from the tree break, its head outstretched, mouth open, teeth shining in the sunlight. Ash waited, watching, but the beast didn't come on. It was almost as if there was a force field separating the house from the rest of the valley. Ash knew that was crazy, but was it? People trained dogs with shock collars and invisible fences, and the memory of the Jersey Devil with clipped wings reminded him that past leaders of the Cryptid Club hadn't been above surgeries and other modifications to control the creatures of the valley, Mira being a prime example. A gunshot rang out in the stillness, a plunk to Ash's right, splinters flying from the doorframe. Ash dropped into a crouch, searching the side of the house and the forest. "Where might we be going?" DePauli yelled, then her unhinged laughter filled the valley. Ash crawled through the back door and locked it behind him. He considered running around the house and locking all the doors and windows, but he quickly discarded the idea. DePauli was probably still up in the portico, and she and Rogers surely had keys. Plus, there were many first-floor windows that could be broken. He still couldn't wrap his noodle around the idea that DePauli was coming for him, with the M4. He limped into the kitchen. He was able to run and walk fine, but now that he was able to slow down, he tried to keep some weight off the leg. He fetched a bottle of wine and opened it, taking a long pull that eased his fighting nerves. He wet a towel, stripped his makeshift bandage off the gunshot wound, pouring some wine on it before taking another long pull. He searched beneath the kitchen sink, in the cabinets, but he found nothing of use. He needed hydrogen peroxide. Even a diluted sample would work. There were 4 unopened water bottles on the counter, their plastic caps still sealed. Ash took one and slipped it in a back pocket. The house creaked and moaned in the stillness, the wind gusting through tiny gaps in the window panes, creating an eerie melody. Ash took a pull of wine and went in search of the cleaning supplies. The house was cleaned regularly, that was easy to see. The bathroom, while of the most basic variety, was always spotless, as was the rest of the house. Ash had smelled bleach, wood polish, so he was certain there was a stash of cleaning supplies somewhere, and diluted hydrogen peroxide was a common ingredient in surface cleaners because of its disinfectant properties. Ash remembered his mom pouring the stuff on his cuts. How he would cry when he saw the brown bottle emerge from the medicine cabinet. The times do change, however, and Ash knew mothers didn't do that anymore because research had shown that hydrogen peroxide damages newly forming cells. These useless thoughts clogged his head as he shuffled down hallways, anticipating encountering DePauli around every turn. But he didn't see her or Rogers. The doors to the dining room were locked. A clock ticked, a floorboard popped, and windows rattled in their panes. Ash searched the hallway broom closet but found nothing. He wandered to the front of the house, searched another small closet off the sitting room, but found no cleaning supplies. He went upstairs. Nothing. He was beginning to despair when he thought of the basement, or perhaps the downstairs bathroom itself. He'd seen no cabinets in the washroom, but he remembered where his mom used to keep the toilet brush and cleaner, and hope surged through him. The washroom was plain, and though Ash had used the toilet and sink, he'd never taken advantage of the stall shower. He lifted his shirt front and sniffed. "Damn, you smell—" The click of a door lock engaging echoed through the silent house and froze Ash in place. There was a lock on the bathroom door, and Ash reached out to turn it, then paused. The room had no windows, and he had no idea where the air vent on the ceiling went, and he didn't want to get trapped. He dropped to a knee, craning his neck so he could see behind the toilet. "Jackpot," Ash said. A toilet brush rested in a white plastic cup, and next to it, a yellow bottle with a narrow spout sat beneath the toilet's tank. The yellow bottle was labeled Crypto Killer, a cleaner even a superhero can't beat. Ash lifted the bottle and examined the white label on its back. The writing was microscopic, and he couldn't read it in the half-light. He stood and opened the bathroom door a crack. Nothing moved in the hallway. He slipped out, closed the door behind him, and headed for his stash of batteries. Ash needed a couple more things, a nail or similar item, and something to hammer it with. That, along with a sealable container, which should be easy to find, would complete his supply list, if the cleaner he'd found was at least 3% hydrogen peroxide, which was common. Sunlight angled through the windows and dust motes floated in the air as Ash slunk through the house. It was odd to be putting his back to the walls, searching the shadows. Just 48 hours prior, he and the others had walked these halls, drinking, discussing their situation. Now everyone was dead, and a crazy bitch was trying to kill him and having fun while doing it. You couldn't make this shit up. He found a corner at the end of the hallway where a picture window displayed the eastern side of the valley. Dark clouds dotted the sky, beams of sunlight angling into the valley. He held the cleaner up to the window and traced his finger along the list of ingredients, and there it was. Hydrogen peroxide, 3%. Back in the kitchen, he recovered a teapot with a sealable lid and one of the dull knives he'd left behind when he'd rummaged through the kitchen at the start of his little adventure in the Andes. A small wood mallet used to tenderize meat completed his search, and Ash put everything in a paper garbage bag and headed for the basement stairs. Ash would recover the batteries where he'd hid them in the basement storage room. Then, he'd find a good hiding place within the maze, make his bomb, and get the hell out of the valley. The stairs creaked and popped as he climbed down into darkness. The batteries were stashed under a pile of old rags that looked drenched in dark blood with green fungus growing around their edges. There were no functioning batteries left, which wasn't really an issue because he wouldn't have used a flashlight anyway. With DePauli searching for him, the last thing he wanted to do was help them find him. Darkness pressed in on him as he slunk through the maze, the deepening cold penetrating him as the perspiration on his back and forehead chilled. The 12C batteries were exactly where he'd left them, and he piled them into the sack with the rest of his supplies. Then he realized with a sickening horror that without light there was no way he could build his bomb. What he needed to do required precision and attention to detail. He had to head back to the house, or... Ash shifted on his feet, his mind trying to convince him that going through the tunnels to the exit into the valley would be less dangerous than heading back up into the house, if that was even possible. If DePauli had done her homework, and at this point, Ash had to assume she had, she might follow him down into the basement and send Rogers or Mira to track him into the tunnel from the other entrance. There were places in the maze where he could hide, but he had to consider the Yeti. Had it been real? It sure had looked real, but Ash couldn't figure out how DePauli pulled off her trickery. If the Yeti was real, there was no way she would have been able to control the beast. But if the creature was fake, a guy in a suit? Ash shook his head. That was nuts. There had to be another explanation. He decided to head back the way he'd come and sneak up to his room. He pulled his karambit and took his time heading back to the stairs, going slow, listening for every creak, every moan of the house. If DePauli or Mira were moving around up there, he couldn't hear them. Rogers, however, could be anywhere. He saw nobody as he went through the house and up the steps. If DePauli meant to track him into the maze, he'd somehow missed her. Not one to look a gift horse in the mouth, Ash entered his room, locked the door, and propped his desk chair under the knob. The process of making a pressure bomb from batteries is simple but extremely dangerous. Most people who try end up burned and in the ICU. Ash opened the door to his balcony a crack, but didn't go outside. He sat Indian style on the threshold, his bag of junk on the floor between his legs. He took the 12 batteries out of the bag and stood them on end in a row. He selected one randomly and put the tip of the knife on top of the negative contact. Ash turned his head and looked away as he gently tapped the knife handle with the meat mallet. After several taps, a hiss of air escaped the battery as the pressure within was released. Ash released the breath he was holding. With the battery no longer under pressure, the fuel cell was basically harmless, with the exception of sulfuric acid, which was part of the battery. Using the knife, he carefully broke open the top of the battery. Within, there was a rolled-up piece of white paper with metal shards sticking from it, and all around that core was black powder, magnesium oxide. Jackpot! Ash pumped the air with his fist. Something had finally gone as expected. Using the knife, Ash scraped all the magnesium oxide into the teapot and ground up the large chunks. Thankfully, the black stuff was already dry, or he would have needed to set it out on the windowsill for a few hours. He repeated this process 11 more times, and when he was done, there was a nice mound of magnesium oxide in the bottom of the kettle. Sweat rolled down his forehead, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand. He was done. All he needed to do once the bomb was placed was add the hydrogen peroxide, seal the teapot, and run. Perspiration dripped into his eyes again, and he used his shirt to dry his face. Ash pulled the bottle of water from his pocket and took a long pull, emptying it and letting the bottle fall to the floor. His stomach ached for a second as the sudden infusion of liquid induced nausea, then faded. He gathered the teapot bomb, his bag of supplies, and got to his feet. A wave of dizziness washed over Ash, and he put out a hand to steady himself on the washstand. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside his room. Ash looked around, frantic. He felt drunk, slow, and all his joints shrieked with pain. He looked down at the empty water bottle, but it had been sealed. With the sickening realization that he'd made a huge mistake, Ash knew plastic caps could be removed without the safety seal being broken if one was careful. Ash's mother echoed in his head, like whenever he did something stupid.
Didn't I tell you not to take food from strangers?
He fell onto his side. Where the hell was Mom's voice when he was debating coming to the valley? The room grew dim, the footsteps louder. Lights out. 31. Ash came awake with a start. Memories of Ophelia, Sasquatch, and the valley washing over him as he opened his eyes. Bright light. Pain. He squinted and rubbed his temples, his forehead aching. His leg wounds screamed, the scratches on his chest pulling and stretching, and his head pounded in rhythm with his hammering heart. Metal tinkled on metal, and he jerked his head toward the sound and found that he was restrained. Birds tittered and insects sang as Ash pulled against his bonds, but they held him tight. The whiteness faded, and he saw Dipali's dark eyes staring into his, a slight smile sliding over her face. He looked away. Ash was strapped to a pole at the center of a clearing, and the small path of hardpan was surrounded by thick walls of evergreen trees so tightly packed it was hard to make out one tree from another. 2 paths trailed away from the clearing, one north and one south. There were no weeds or grass, and the brown patch of rock-strewn hardpan was stained with dark patches of dried blood. Dipali took Ash's chin in her hand and turned his head so they once again looked into each other's eyes. She shook her head and let Ash's chin fall to his chest. He heard the click of his karambit opening and he looked up. Dipali spun the knife on her index finger, smiling. When she saw him looking at her, she said, "Nice little weapon. Love the fiberglass blade so airport security can't pick it up. Did you make it?" Ash said nothing and did his best to look belligerent, which wasn't hard. Dipali spun and lashed out with the blade, slicing Ash's forearm. He flinched, blood dripping from the scratch. "Sharp," she said, and laughed. "What do you want with me?" Ash's voice cracked and he flinched. He already sounded dead, beaten. Dipali made a show of spinning the knife, sliding side to side in a fighting stance. Ash could tell the woman had been trained in martial arts by the smooth way she moved from one stance to the next. "Why not just kill me? Then you win." She froze mid-form, her eyes sliding to his. "Would I? Really?" Ash said nothing. "No," she said. She shook her head as she continued moving around with the blade. "I'll let one of the beasts finish you. Then I will have truly won." "You're insane." Anger flashed in her eyes, and she struck out with the karambit again, putting a thin scratch across Ash's cheek. Ash did his best not to react, but as the hot blood dripped down his face, anger welled in him and his cheeks burned. "I'm gonna kill you," he said, and blinked. He couldn't believe what he'd said. He'd never threatened a person's life, despite having had the thought many times. Dipali's eyes widened, then narrowed as her lips thinned to a red line. "I'm showing you respect. Don't you get that?" Ash said nothing, pain reminding him he was tied to a pole. Respect? But he had to stay quiet. She was getting ready to spill it. He could just feel it coming like a 20-foot wave. "I just figured you, the real winner, at least deserved an explanation before I take it all away from you." Ash let that revelation sit there like a fart in a movie theater. The real winner? She sighed. "Look, I understand you're pissed and confused. I played you like a violin. Nobody likes being used." Ash said nothing. "And you're probably wondering the hows and whys?" she said. Ash let his eyes stray around the clearing as he tried to act disinterested. He wondered where Rogers was. "I guess the best place to start is at the beginning," Dipali said. She sat on a stone, bracelets tinkling. "Any way you can let me down from here?" Ash said. His hands and feet were turning a light shade of purple as the circulation to his extremities was restricted. She laughed, not a normal, jovial laugh, but the manic, deranged cackle of someone who was gone, someone who had left reality behind. "I got the invitation at the perfect time," she said, ignoring Ash's faint squeals of pain. "I was on the balls of my ass, as you Americans say, and I was headed for the street again." She paused and looked hard at Ash.
The streets are like prison, and I am never going back there.
Ash nodded slightly. He needed to buy time, figure a way to get free, but he had little hope and even less strength. Even if he managed to get free, the M4 hung over Polly's shoulder and she could gun him down at any moment.
I got here early, seduced one of the locals pretending to be a rich countess.
She looked up at the clearing sky and chuckled.
The dumbass didn't have a chance. So, Treemont and his little bot weren't prepared when I arrived early, and...
A strange crooked smile inched over her face, the look of an insane woman.
I started the competition a little early. You might say I took control of things.
There really is a Treemont? He blurted. What did you do with him? She smiled.
So, we are paying attention. Yeah, there was a Treemont. The invitation, the whole thing, it was all legit. He had some rare form of cancer. Only had a few months to live, so no guilt there.
How had Ash not seen this woman for who she was? He'd seen none of the signs. She was beautiful and engaging, and she'd taken advantage of him.
Anyway, he meant for us to compete, as the invitation said. No doubt he expected casualties, but from what I could tell, he didn't mean any of us harm. He seemed like a nice man, actually.
And you just murdered him, Ash said. His anger and frustration grew, eating at him, his worries of survival ebbing, taking a back seat to his rage. She punched with the blade, pulling up just short of his face.
Make no mistake, I have killed a few good men and many more bad ones. Do you know how I decide which is which?
The blade danced before Ash's face, and he said nothing, but the bottom of his stomach dropped out.
I was raped when I was 8. 8, Ash.
Ash sighed. Polly had been broken long before she'd come to the valley. He suspected, and he was sure this revelation and self-justification was just the tip of the tuna.
So don't tell me about murder. I'm sure he deserved it. You haven't seen the lab, she said.
But he'd seen some of the work performed there. Ash's stomach turned, pain leaking through his chest.
Yes,
she laughed again.
I see you know what I mean.
He said nothing.
It wasn't hard getting the access code to Treemont's research computer. Treemont was a frail old man. He gave me the code for Rogers also, with a little coaxing. Oh yes, the tin can helped, all along the way, watching, reporting. The bot knew most of the plans, so once Treemont was out of the way, I was able to see what Treemont had planned.
She stopped flipping the karambit and slipped it in a pocket. Curiosity was now racing with his anger, taking front position. What was the deal with the poem, the statues? She cackled loud and hard.
Yes, quite the little mystery. I'm no UN Owen, however, but I try to keep up appearances, make you all believe you are still playing Treemont's little game.
Polly said.
I stood back and let Treemont's plans unfold until they became, detrimental to my overall goals.
When she saw the recognition in his eyes, she continued.
The deaths of Snake and Augie went off without a hitch, but then things went off the rails a little.
Ash stared forward, mind spinning, but he said nothing. Something caught his eye in the periphery of his vision, but he didn't dare shift his head and look.
Old longing's nomadic leap, chafing at custom's chain, again from its brumal sleep, wakens the ferine strain,
Polly recited.
Obvious now that we're at the end, no?
How did you do it? Make Tallboy kill? I've seen him several times, and whatever you did was temporary. Drugs? Ash asked. She nodded.
I may have given Tallboy a larger dose than Treemont had planned.
She smiled a wicked grin.
I figured Augie wouldn't be able to control himself, just like you. Given the opportunity to prove he wasn't crazy, that Bonyeps truly existed was more important to him than anything, and he let his guard down.
Ash looked at the ground, then to the forest. 2 yellow eyes shined from the shade beneath the tree canopy, the ape-like face of Tallboy easing from the shadows. But why? How? He had to keep her talking.
Snake was first because he knew who I was. He told you all on the helicopter ride, if you recall. He deserved what he got. After I administered the drug to Tallboy, I had Rogers create a diversion that led Snake right to Tallboy. The Sasquatch was in an ultra-aggressive state. And add Snake's rashness and ego, and things fell right into place, DePauli said. The ease with which she spoke, the total lack of remorse, worried Ash more than the M4 on her shoulder. You were with me when we found him. That was a neat trick. Fooled me. Well played. Well played. Don't beat yourself up, Ash. It's just business, not personal.
Everything about this is personal now. She ignored him and said,
Augie went exactly as planned. I knew he wouldn't be able to stop himself, but Ito's death was the first curveball.
Ash recalled the sound when the spider had landed on Ito.
After the torpor of will, morbid the inner strife, welcome the animal thrill, lending a zest to life.
DePauli laughed again.
This one was supposed to be my challenge. The spider. And Rogers was to watch the scene and drive off the beast if needed, but I changed things up a little.
So, like I said, you're a murderer. As soon as the words left Ash's lips, he wished he could have them back. A dark cloud of anger spread over DePauli's face, then dissipated.
No, I am not totally innocent. And in Snake's case, maybe guilty. But the competition was designed to test your limits, and I'm sure, as I've already said, Treemont didn't expect you all to survive, despite whatever personal feelings he may have had.
But he was going to kill those who lived. It was DePauli's turn to say nothing. A beast shrieked in the jungle, a wail of anger and hunger.
We're running out of time, Mr. Cohn, she said.
So you and the bot just killed everyone else, played this stupid game with the statues. Ash sensed their talk was coming to an end, and when that happened...
No, Rogers wouldn't allow it. He's got some kind of core programming that won't let him harm another human. Very iRobot.
What about the rest of them? Ash didn't know much about homicidal killers, but he'd seen enough James Bond movies to know that the mastermind always wanted to reveal their brilliance, show the losers how they were beaten.
I tried to stay with the poem, and the melee was pre-planned, so I just let that happen.
And Emeka, Otto, the others?
Voices of solitude call, whispers of sedge and stream, loosen the fetters that gall, back to the primal scheme.
She guffawed.
Back to the primal scheme. Rogers told me Treemont meant to have us living off the land by day 3.
She harumphed.
Back to the primal scheme, my shapely Indian ass.
DePauli shot Ash what he thought she believed to be a seductive look, but instead looked more like a demented clown. Ash flinched. She frowned and stuck her chin out in defiance.
Mira helped with Emeka. She takes basic instruction, as you've seen, and is somewhat brainwashed to follow the commands of whoever feeds her. And Otto?
She waved a hand before her face, and the rifle slipped from her shoulder. She inched the gun's strap back into position and said,
Otto was simple. I left some bait for the devil, left a trail of breadcrumbs for Otto, who followed them without question.
The pilot?
Ah, yes. I have to give Treemont credit for that one. That was all set up long before any of us arrived, so I just stood back and watched.
And if he'd lived?
DePauli shrugged. After that, well, you saw most of it.
Ash remembered how Sean had attacked the pilot, died from the gunshot wounds. You were with me. Consoled me. Ash was doing his best to sound hurt, but even he could tell his fury was seeping through. DePauli said nothing. Candace? You killed her in cold blood. DePauli rubbed her arm, and Ash recalled Candace getting a piece of her with Sean's knife.
That one I regret a little. I wanted to see which one of you would betray the other.
And if we didn't? DePauli patted the M4. So what about you? I saw you die. How did you pull that off? Ash was out of questions and out of time. Tallboy's face faded back into the forest as another primal roar echoed through the valley and pushed over the clearing. The breeze made Ash shiver, and he pulled on his bonds.
What did you see?
She was smiling, so very proud of herself.
It was a bit of deception. See, Rogers told me the Yeti can't see very well in the dark.
But I saw it strike you down.
You did?
She smiled so broadly Ash thought she might hurt her face.
I admit that was the most difficult part of the entire affair. The drugs helped, though, but it was still scary.
She cackled. With nothing left to say and no plan, Ash said, "So you'll let the beasts get me and you're the new king of the hill?" She nodded.
That's the plan. Any last words? Anyone back home you need me to contact?
Ash felt like he'd drunk a shot of molten lava.
Oh, that's right. You've got nobody. But hey, at least you saw Bigfoot, right?
She stepped forward, smiled, and pecked Ash on the cheek.
Sorry about this. Really, I am. You know how I tricked you?
Ash said nothing, didn't even look at her. His eyes were focused on the forest where he hoped to see Tallboy's face, but there was nothing there except the thick evergreens. She pushed the hair from his face with her index finger.
I like you, Ash. That was real.
Well, why kill me then? I'll leave. You can have the valley. I don't want it. Her eyes went wide as quarters.
Or we can stay here in the valley together.
Ash threw up in his mouth a little. Her face grew tight, then slackened.
I'm not going to kill you. I'm just going to win the game.
What does it matter? You've cheated. She cackled.
I changed the rules. Big difference.
She lowered her head and stared at the hardpan.
Goodbye, Ash. Good luck in the next life.
Then she scampered off into the forest, bracelets tinkling. Late morning turned into afternoon, and the sun had arced past noon when something pushed through the forest. Ash's bet was on Mira. He pulled on his bonds, but his hands and feet were numb, and both his legs had fallen asleep. The scratches on his chest ached, the wound on his leg pulsed, and the new slash on his forearm yelled for attention. Ash doubted he'd be able to stand, let alone fight. If it wasn't Mira, the devil, a bunyip, Sasquatch, Ash found that he just didn't care anymore. Branches cracked, leaves fell, and the woods went still as the massive beast emerged from the undergrowth. It looked like a Sasquatch, but it walked on all four limbs. Its hair was short and gray, not a tangled mess of brown and black fur. When the beast saw Ash strapped to the pole, it paused, looking him up and down. Then, with a scream of rage that made Ash's ears ring, the creature charged. From the shadows of the forest, Rogers watched. The game wasn't over. 2 remained. 32. Tallboy stepped from the trees, threw his massive head back, and roared. Slime dripped from his thick fangs, and his face was twisted with rage. The charging bear-like creature glanced in Tallboy's direction, but didn't slow. Ash cringed and waited to be mauled. Tallboy roared again, and this time when the advancing creature turned in his direction, the Sasquatch was on the move. Hope stirred Ash's emotions, and he silently urged Tallboy on. The Sasquatch was a blur, and before the strange beast could react, Tallboy slammed into the creature. Grunts and snarls filled the glade as the cryptids rolled and pulled at each other. Tallboy's right arm jackhammered up and down as he relentlessly pounded the beast's head as the creature fought to sink its 2-inch claws into the Bigfoot. Clouds of dust and dirt lifted from the hardpan, filling the small clearing. Nothing moved in the forest beyond, at least nothing Ash could see. Were the unseen eyes watching him still? Was Rogers hiding in the underbrush? Tallboy raked his claws against his adversary's chest, and blood geysered through the gashes, spraying the gray fur, turning it black. The wounded beast bellowed and rolled away, whimpering as it pressed its hands to its chest, trying to stop the bleeding. Tallboy gathered himself to his full height, looking down on the wounded beast. The creature growled but backed away until it was at the edge of the forest, then it turned and disappeared into the undergrowth, snapping branches and shifting vegetation marking its departure. Tallboy stared after the creature for several minutes, standing still as stone as the sun vanished beyond the lip of the valley. Ash hung limp from his pole, watching Tallboy, hoping beyond hope that the beast wouldn't notice him or would leave him alone. But that was crazy. He'd seen what the creature had done to Snake. But then Ash remembered what DePauli had said, and the poem. Again from its brumal sleep wakens the ferine strain. But Tallboy had been drugged. Was he again wrapped in brumal sleep? He couldn't feel his legs or hands, and his arms tingled to his shoulders, wounds thrumming. Tallboy turned his angry glare on Ash, and he felt a zap of energy cramp his neck and run down his spine. He shuddered, the cold breeze bringing the scent of blood. The Bigfoot lumbered forward, matted hair swaying, muscles rippling. His footfalls were like the coming of an elephant, and clouds of dust rose from the hardpan as he approached. His ape-like face wasn't angry, nor was it serene. The beast's yellow eyes had lost their murderous glare, and the creature's claws had been retracted beneath the mounds of fur that covered its hands. But anger lines still crisscrossed its black leather-like face. The Sasquatch came forward until he was standing so close to Ash he could smell the beast's rancid breath. The Bigfoot leaned in, putting his face an inch from Ash's. Ash trembled like a tiger was prancing around him. Sweat dripped from every pore, and his vision went red as he held his breath. Tallboy lifted a hand, but no claws were extended. The Sasquatch brushed Ash's face with the back of his monkey-like hand, and it took a monumental effort not to flinch. The beast's eyes shifted, and Tallboy inched past Ash. Seconds dripped away. A minute. Ash felt the tension in his bonds slacken, and he wiggled his wrists. The slashed rope bonds fell away. He shuffled his feet and almost fell. Ash didn't leave the safety of the pole. He kept his back pressed to the wood, waiting for Tallboy to appear before him. When the Sasquatch didn't appear, he mustered the courage to look over his shoulder and found that Tallboy was gone. He dropped to his knees, legs numb, arms stinging. He rolled onto his side, head pounding. Slowly, he flexed his arms and legs, twisting and cracking his joints. His chest wound stung, and the cut on his leg pulsed with pain, but the slash on his arm had stopped bleeding and no longer hurt. When he got feeling back in his arms, he shook his hands wildly in the air, whipping them back and forth, circulating blood. He made fists, over and over, and the redness faded from the tips of his fingers. He flexed his legs, repeating the procedure until his entire body hurt. Scattered clouds fleeted by, patches of faint blue sky fading to dusk as the sun dropped below the western edge of the Andes Mountains. He felt cold, hungry. His head pounded, and angst gnawed at the edges of his nerves. He'd been so confident when he'd arrived in the valley, so certain he could handle whatever was thrown his way. But as he stared up at the sky, his eyes leaking tears, he just didn't give a shit anymore. He sat up, still flexing his arms and legs. DePauli had taken Sean's knife. He got to his feet and searched the forest where she'd thrown the blade, and Ash found it easily. He cracked his neck and rolled his shoulders as he walked, pain stretching through him like lightning. Ash's options were few. He could see if DePauli had messed with his makeshift bomb. Most likely she'd taken it, but if she hadn't, perhaps he could continue with his plan to blow the door in the mines. There had to be a way out of the valley that way. Or he could find DePauli, finish the dangerous game she'd started, and take the valley and everything in it for his own. Turn things for the good. He felt no great guilt for those who'd been killed. He'd hardly known Sean and Candace, and the rest he hadn't known at all, but he wasn't a murderer. There was something in Ash, that most basic of human beliefs, that told him killing another human is a crime against nature. Something one never forgets unless they've slipped into darkness. Had he slipped into darkness? He didn't know, but what he did know was he couldn't stay in the clearing, which, judging by the bloodstains, was some type of feeding area. He flipped the 12-inch knife, the clipped blade made of black carbon steel. Ash admired the notched blade and the dark wood handle with gold and brass mosaic pins. He remembered how Sean had chosen the weapon and left his statue behind. It had all been a crock of shit. He threaded through the forest, staying silent, slipping in and out of the shadows. Regardless of what he decided to do, he didn't want DePauli to know he was alive. With his legs and arms back in working order, pain knifed through him from his leg wound and the multiple bruises and knife slashes on his arms and face. His joints ached, and his stomach screamed for food, his mouth dry, and a new worry wedged its way into the conversation. He could no longer trust the food and water provided to him, and that was a big problem. Even if he managed to survive and get out of the valley, he was days away from supplies, and he had no money. The grayness of dusk leaked over the valley as Ash exited the forest onto the main path. The blue granite house sat to the east, its dark angular roof sticking above the trees. He found Dipali sitting at the edge of the lake, her back to him. Cressel's long gray neck stuck from the lake, a mound of white water surrounding the massive beast. The creature squeaked and whined as Dipali tossed fish into the water. The M4 rested against one of the dock's supports, several feet away from her. Any thoughts of attack or of stealing the weapon fled when Mira appeared out of the vegetation. The mecha beast patrolled up and down the beach, its dark eyes scanning the lake and the forest's edge. Ash looked over his shoulder at the house. With Dipali outside, he could slip into the house, find some food and head down into the mines, but something held him in place.
You going to just let her get away with it? After everything she's done?
It was Mom's voice again. He rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles. She had a point. He bent, picked up a stone the size of a golf ball, and hurled it into the forest. It slapped through some leaves and thumped into a tree. Mira didn't even notice, and Dipali tossed fish to Cressel. He tried again, and again, nothing. Ash grabbed a smaller stone, weighing it in his hand as he bounced it in his palm. He drew back his arm and threw a dart right at Dipali's head. The rock plunked off her skull and she screamed, jerking her head around, searching the forest. She bounced to her feet, snatched up the M4, and leveled the weapon at the woods. Dipali opened up, sweeping the gun back and forth, her arm shaking, the gun rattling as 30 shells spit from the weapon in 10 seconds. She screamed with rage as bullets peppered the forest, but the shots were wild and came nowhere near Ash, where he hid 20 feet away behind a stone.
Find what threw that rock, now!
Dipali yelled, and Mira scurried into the forest.
If that's you, tall boy, I'll have Mira beat your ass red!
Dipali snapped the empty clip from the M4 and searched in her pocket for the spare. Ash bolted from the forest, throwing himself forward in an uneven gait that sent shards of pain running through his legs. Sweat dripped into his eyes, pressure spreading through his chest, his leg wounds screaming. Dipali pulled the clip free of her pocket, and she braced the rifle on her leg as she focused on inserting the fresh magazine. As the clip clicked home, she sensed Ash and spun, bringing up the gun and firing blindly. A ribbon of bullets stitched across the hard pan to Ash's left. He dove forward, bowling into Dipali like a linebacker filling a hole. His shoulder drove into the woman's chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, driving her to the ground. Dipali's ribs cracked and popped, and a gust of air escaped her lips as Ash pressed her to the ground. He gripped her wrist, pressing the rifle to the ground. With his other hand, he slapped her hard across the face. She went for Ash's eyes, and he punched her in the jaw. Dipali fell back and screamed. A sickening dread fell over Ash. He'd never hit a woman, never even put a hand on a woman in an aggressive way. This was survival, but still, a lifetime of moral brainwashing made him pause for an instant in his fury. Dipali rolled away, gasping and crying, jerking the gun free, aiming it at Ash. He pushed the gun away and pressed her and the rifle back to the ground. He reached inside her back pocket, the one he'd seen her drop the karambit into, and when he felt the knife's smooth plastic, he pulled the blade free. Dipali pulled the trigger, and the M4 barked, the wild shots randomly peppering the woods, the pop and crack of the gunpowder expanding, echoing off the stone walls of the valley. Ash opened the karambit with a flick of his wrist and slashed Dipali across the neck. Dipali froze, her eyes widening. Then she choked up blood as the gash on her neck opened and her head fell to the side. Her skull hit the ground with a thump and puff of dirt, and she lay still, a pool of dark blood leaking into the dirt around her. Ash wept, all the emotions of the last 5 days spilling from him. He dropped to the ground, chin falling to his chest. He sat staring at Dipali's corpse for a long time, the bloody karambit hanging from his index finger. It wasn't until he heard the whomp whomp of an approaching helicopter and the whir of Roger's maneuvering jets that he allowed himself a brief sigh of relief. Darkness stretched its shadowy fingers across the valley as Ash strolled around the house. The thumping of the helicopter rotors grew louder, and it wouldn't be long before the whirlybird arrived. How could that be? Ash wasn't sure. He could only speculate that the craft had been waiting nearby for Roger's signal. Ash avoided the house, though he saw no real reason he had to. He was the last, and if he wasn't, well, so be it. He'd had enough. He followed the Yellowstone path to the clearing where the helicopter had dropped them off, and in the distance, Rogers hovered next to the monument watching him. Ash threaded through the tall grass, working his way toward the bot. He looked over his shoulder, and though the helicopter's rotor wash thundered through the valley, he still couldn't see the craft. So Treemont was a man of his word, Ash said when he reached the bot. All goals are achieved, each parameter met, and only one remains, Rogers said. Per Dr. Tremont's instructions, I am declaring you the winner. Ash Cohn, you are the new leader of the Cryptid Club and the master of this valley. The darkness deepened, and stars blinked overhead as a chill breeze pushed through the Andes, stirring leaves and twisting tree branches. A beast howled, and the cry was met with a series of yelps, roars, growls, and grunts. Ash didn't know what to say. He felt dirty. He literally still had blood on his hands. What is it you command? Rogers said. A spotlight arced over the mountain peaks as the copter banked hard to the south, the pilot bringing the craft in slow as it dropped to the ground. The pounding of the rotors tore at the vegetation, and dirt lifted into the air as the copter landed with a thud, its tinted windows dark. Sir, what is it you command? Ash said nothing. He considered grabbing a stick and smashing the robot to hell, but then who would take care of the valley? Make sure the beasts that needed help got it. Rogers beeped and buzzed. Keep the place running, Ash said. But the valley is yours, Mr. Cohn. The bot's lens eyes scoped out. Call me Ash. He stared out at the Andes, looked back over his shoulder at the house, then over at the copter. Ash strode toward the helicopter and didn't look back. Mr. Cohn, where are you going? The bot's voice whined. Darkness pressed in around Ash as he vanished into the night. The end. This has been The Cryptid Club. Written by Edward J. McFadden III. Narrated by Matthew Crow. Copyright 2021 by Severed Press. Production copyright by Severed Press.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.